The Thren were 3 moves from breaking the line, and Sub-Commander Veth Oma already knew the flagship's tacticians would not see it in time. He watched the battle plate anyway. Above the command dome of the Sethuns reached the daylight of a pale blue world poured in through the crystal, washing the holographic swarm in cold morning color, and every officer on the ring stood in that light and read the same field and drew the same wrong conclusion. The Thren skirmish wing was pressing the Conquered's 5th picket. Standard, contain and grind. The tacticians tagged it a probe and rotated a reserve squadron to blunt it, and Veth felt the old sick certainty settle behind his 3 eyes, the certainty that had ridden him through 9 years of losing. It was not a probe. Veth had fought the Thren since he was young enough to still believe the Conquered would win, and he had learned their grammar the way you learn a language you are beaten with. A probe did not commit its 2nd echelon that early. This one had, which meant the picket was the bait and the reserve squadron was the target, and by the time anyone on the ring understood that, the reserve would already be inside the closing jaw. He opened his mouth to say it. He was a sub-commander. He was allowed to say it, though it would be noted again that Oma saw ghosts. He did not get the chance. The dome's rear iris cycled, and strategist counselor Orith Vane came onto the command ring with a thing walking behind him on a tether of 2 armed wardens, and the temperature of the room changed in a way that had nothing to do with the light. Veth had heard the rumors like everyone else, the Directorate's new instrument, the Praxis subject. He had assumed, as most of the fleet had assumed, that it was a machine, some captured Thren cogitator the medical caste had gutted and restrung. He had not expected it to walk. He had not expected it to be small. The creature was a human. Veth had seen humans exactly twice, both times as corpses being catalogued, and he had filed them the way the Conquered filed all of the verge stock. Interesting, dangerous in the primitive way a landslide is dangerous, not relevant to a war fought between civilizations. This one was a female of the species, young by the smoothness of the skin, a head shorter than the wardens flanking her, dressed in a plain gray recovery suit with the medical caste seal at the collar. Her scalp had been shaved to stubble on one side where the iridect had done their work, and the skin there was still marked with the faint healed lines of it, and she had a scrape along one cheekbone that no one had bothered to treat. She was not restrained beyond the tether. She did not look at the wardens. She did not look at Orith. She looked at the battle plate, and Veth watched her eyes move, and he understood with a small cold lurch that she was reading it the way he read it, fast, in jumps, the eyes landing on exactly the points that mattered and skipping everything the tacticians were staring at. "Subject will observe," Orith said. His 4 hands were folded in the scholar's rest, upper pair over lower, the posture the Directorate elite used to tell a room that they were thinking and the room was not. "Fleet Master, if you would permit a demonstration." Fleet Master Drod Corvin turned from the plate. He was old reptilian stock, green-scaled and heavy through the shoulders, a soldier who had climbed on victories in a younger, easier war, and he wore his skepticism openly because rank let him. "You want me to stand my ring aside for your pet, counselor?" "I want you to keep fighting your battle exactly as you intend," Orith said. "The subject will merely say what happens next. You lose nothing. You may even learn something." Drod's throat scales flared, but he was losing this engagement and the whole ring knew it, and a losing fleet master cannot afford to look afraid of a demonstration. He flicked 2 claws. "Let it speak, then." Every eye went to the human. She did not perform. That was the first thing Veth noted and could not stop noting afterward. She did not draw herself up or gesture at the plate. She stood with her weight even, hands loose, and she spoke to the room in the fleet's trade tongue with a flat, unhurried voice that had clearly been drilled into the translator patch at her throat, and what she said was, "Your 5th picket is bait. The Thren wing that's pressing it committed its 2nd echelon 40 seconds ago, which they don't do for a probe. The reserve squadron you just rotated in is the thing they're actually shooting at. In about 90 seconds their skirmish wing will fold sideways. She lifted one hand flat and tilted it. Like that, off the picket and onto the reserve's open flank, and the picket, which you've written off, will turn out to still have teeth and close the other side. Your reserve squadron is going to be inside a box. If you want to save it, you have to pull it now, before the fold, not after. Silence on the ring. Drod's tacticians looked at the plate, looked at each other, looked at the plate. The picket is spent, one of them said. It's down to a third strength, it can't close anything. It's pretending to be spent, the human said. She had already gone back to watching the plate. Watch the 7 ships on its trailing edge. They haven't fired since the engagement opened. Empty ships don't hold formation like that. Those are full and cold and waiting. Veth found that he had stopped breathing through his ventral slits. He looked at the 7 ships on the picket's trailing edge. They were holding formation like that. Counselor, Drod said, low, dangerous, if this is theater. It is not theater, Orith said. Sub-Commander Oma. He did not turn his head. He had a counselor's habit of knowing where everyone in a room stood. You have a reputation for seeing ghosts. Do you see one now? The whole ring turned to Veth. He had wanted, 10 minutes ago, to be asked. Now the wanting felt like a trap that had been set for him a long time before he walked into it. No, Veth said. His voice came out level. I see what she sees. The reserve should come out. Drod held for one heartbeat longer than command allowed, and in that heartbeat the Thren's skirmish wing folded sideways off the picket, exactly as the human had said, off the picket and onto the reserve squadron's open flank, and the 7 cold ships on the picket's trailing edge lit their drives all at once and swung to close the other side. Pull the reserve, Drod said, too late, and everyone on the ring knew it was too late, and the human said, quietly, not to Drod and not to anyone, too late now. Angle them down and out through the picket's low quarter. It's the only face of the box that isn't finished closing. You'll lose the 2 ships on the trailing edge, but the rest live. Drod gave the order because he had nothing else. The reserve squadron dove down and out through the low quarter of the closing box, and it lost the 2 ships on the trailing edge, and the rest lived. The battle plate went quiet in the way battles do when a jaw closes on nothing. The Thren, robbed of the kill, disengaged with the sullen economy of a predator that has learned this prey costs more than it feeds. In 90 seconds the 5th picket had gone from a disaster to a scar. 2 ships. In the arithmetic of the 9th year of a losing war, 2 ships was a mercy. No one on the command ring said anything. The light of the pale blue world went on pouring through the dome, indifferent, and in it the small human female stood and watched the plate settle with an expression Veth could not read, because it was not triumph and it was not fear, and it was not anything he had a name for. It was the face of someone doing arithmetic that had already finished. Orith let the silence work. He was a strategist. He understood that a thing proven in silence is proven harder than a thing announced. The subject's designation is Sailor Rourke, he said at last, mildly, as if introducing a colleague. The Iridect recovered her 4 months ago from a human convoy we intercepted at the Marrow approaches. She was, in her own society, a hazard analyst. She read weather and traffic and sensor noise for a rescue service, and she was, by the standards of even her own kind, unusually good at it. The medical cast examined why. Then they improved it. He unfolded his upper hands a small degree, the scholar's equivalent of a shrug. You have just watched the return on that improvement, Fleet Master. She read your battle 9 years faster than your tacticians and 3 moves ahead of the enemy. And she has not yet finished healing. Drod looked at the human for a long moment. It's a machine now, he said. You made it a machine. No, Sayla said. It was the first time she had spoken without being told to. The ring went still again. She did not raise her voice. Veth would come to understand that she never raised her voice, that raising it was a thing she had no use for. A machine only knows what you feed it, she said, still watching the plate, not the Fleet Master. I know what you're all about to do. That's different." Then she turned her head, unhurried, and for the first time she looked directly at Orth Vane, and she said, in the same flat voice she had used to save 2/3 of a squadron, "You should tell them you're going to keep me for the whole campaign. They'd rather hear it from you than work it out for themselves." Orth's 4 hands did not move. But something behind his composed scholar's face went very still, the stillness of a man who has just felt a floor he thought was solid shift by a hair's width under his weight. And Veth, watching, filed it, the way he filed everything, and did not yet understand what he had seen. They took her back down through the flagship's spine to the medical decks, and Sailor Rourke let them, because letting them was cheaper than not, and because she had already seen how the corridor ended. She could not stop seeing how things ended. That was the part no one had explained to her before they opened the door in her head, and it was the part she would not have believed if they had. It had not felt like a gift. She remembered from before, from the version of herself that had ridden a rescue tender out of the Marrow relay stations reading storm fronts off a cracked display, that she had always been quick with patterns. She had been the one who called the debris cascades before the sensors did, who knew which distress beacon was real and which was a wreck's dying echo, who could look at a board full of noise and find the one moving thing that mattered. It had made her good at a small job on a small station at the edge of human space. It had made her, she understood now, exactly the kind of raw material the Iridect had been trawling the verge for. The insectoid surgeons had not been cruel. That was somehow worse. Chirurgeon Prime Osk, whose blue chitinous face she had learned to read the way she now read everything, had spoken to her throughout in the gentle, absorbed voice of a craftsman narrating his own hands, and had told her she was fortunate, that most of the verge stock they sampled were too coarse in the relevant structures to be worth the work, that she was a rarity, a fine instrument found in a scrapyard. They had not, in any sense she could point to, damaged her. They had found the thing she already did and taken the walls off it. Now she did it all the time. She did it when she did not want to. She had walked onto the command ring a quarter hour ago, and before Orth had finished his first sentence she had read the whole room, the fleet master's brittle pride, the tacticians who had stopped thinking and started defending, the sub-commander with the wrong-shaped eyes who saw what she saw and was ashamed of it, the wardens who would move left before right because their weapons hung on the left. She had read the battle in the same breath. And she had read, in the space behind Orth Vane's folded hands, the shape of a thing much larger and much colder than a battle, a thing he had not said, a thing that had staging orders and fuel depots and a second target, and she had let him see, for 1 hair's width of a second, that she had read it. That had been a mistake. She had made it on purpose, to know how he would move when frightened, and now she knew. He went very still, and he did not reach for the obvious lever. That told her more about the shape of his plan than a month of watching would have. The medical deck's recovery cell closed around her, clean and warm and daylit by a false window. The Iridect kept tuned to a spectrum they had decided humans found calming. Sayla sat on the shelf that served as a bed and did not find it calming. She found it a room with 1 door, a ventilation grill she could not fit through, and a monitoring lens in the upper corner that Osk insisted was for her health. She had 4 months of healing left, Orth had said. He was wrong about that, the way he was wrong about several things he was certain of, and she had let him be wrong. The healing was nearly done. The door in her head was fully open. She had been hiding how far it had opened for 11 days now, giving them reads a fraction slower and a fraction shallower than she could, letting them believe the instrument was still warming up, because an instrument that is still warming up is watched less carefully than one that is finished. She lay back on the shelf and closed her eyes, which did nothing, because the patterns did not live in her eyes. They had brought her here to win their war. She had understood that much in the first week. What she had spent the 11 days since understanding was that winning their war was not the whole of what she was for, and that the rest of it, the part with the fuel depots staged wrong and the second target, and the extra berths the Iridect were quietly building 3 decks below this one. The rest of it was aimed at the exact place she had come from, and at the people who were, right now, coming to look for her. She had seen the tracks of them 4 days ago, in a navigation feed she was not supposed to be able to parse. A human formation, small, undergunned, moving on a careful vector toward the Marrow approaches. A relief flotilla. Her convoy had been overdue for 4 months. Someone had come to find out why. Someone always came. It was the thing about her people the Conquered had catalogued as a weakness, and she knew to be the opposite. She had not let anyone see that she had seen it. Sayla Rourke lay in the warm daylit cell the aliens had built to keep her calm, and she ran the pattern forward, move after move after move, the way the surgeons had made her unable to stop doing, and somewhere around the 9th move she found the place where it broke, faint and far off and hers alone to reach. It would take everything she had, and several things she did not yet have. It would cost. She had already found the parts that would cost and made herself look at them until they stopped moving. Then she opened her eyes, because the door was about to cycle. 2 seconds later it cycled, and Chirurgeon Prime Osk came in to tell her she was healing beautifully, and Sayla told him, in a tired, grateful voice, that she still could not see very far ahead yet, and watched him believe her. In 11 days, the Sethuns reach 1-4 engagements it should have drawn and drew 2 it should have lost, and by the end of it the fleet had stopped calling Sayla Rourke the subject. They called her the Reed, as in, hold the advance until we have the Reed, as in, the Reed says the Thren are massing at Serral and it's a feint, don't take the bait. It happened the way these things happen in a war, not by decision but by exhaustion. 9 years of losing had worn the Conquered's officers down to a single reflex, which was to distrust anything that promised it would stop, and the human had broken that reflex the only way it could be broken, by being right over and over until being right was cheaper to believe than to fight. Veth Oma watched it happen from the tactical ring and did not like what he felt, which was hope, because he had learned to treat hope as the sound a trap makes closing. He had made it his business to be on the ring whenever they brought her up. He told himself it was diligence. In truth, he wanted to watch her work, because watching her work was the closest thing to an education he had received in a decade. She did not do what the tacticians did, which was to game out branches. She did not seem to calculate at all. She looked at a field and said what it was, the way a man looks at a face and says it is angry, and then the field became what she had said, and the first few times Veth had assumed luck or fraud, and now he assumed neither. On the 12th day, he was close enough to hear her do the thing that changed how he understood her. A Thren raiding column had come apart against the fleet's flank exactly as she had called, and Drod, who had begun to treat her reads as his own insight delivered by an unpleasant courier, was already turning to order the pursuit, and Sayla said without being asked, "Don't chase them into the said drift." Drod's throat scales flared. "The pursuit is standard, they're broken, we finish broken columns." "They're not broken. They came apart on purpose to pull your pursuit into the drift, where their heavy elements are sitting cold behind the dust." She had not looked up from the plate. "It's the same shape they used on your 5th picket the first day I was up here. They like this shape. They'll keep using it until it stops working, and it hasn't stopped working because you keep chasing." And then, in the same flat breath, she said the thing Veth would turn over for a long time afterward. "You're going to order the pursuit anyway, because you've already decided, and then in about 40 seconds a runner from the drift picket is going to bring you a contact report that makes you cancel it, and you'll tell yourself the report is why. So we can do it the slow way with the report or the fast way without it. Your fleet master, I only work here." Drod opened his jaws to order the pursuit. A runner came onto the ring from the drift picket with a contact report. Drod closed his jaws, read the report, and canceled the pursuit, and told himself the report was why. Veth watched the human's face while it happened and saw nothing on it, no satisfaction, no contempt, and understood that she had not been mocking the fleet master. She had simply been reading him, the same way she read the Thren, and reporting what she read because to her the fleet master and the Thren and the runner from the drift picket were all the same kind of thing, pieces on a field, moving the way their nature made them move. She was not predicting the enemy. She was predicting everyone. The enemy was just the part they had pointed her at. That was the day Veth stopped sleeping well. Because if she could read Drod, who was standing in front of her, whom she had known for 12 days, then she could read Orth Vane, who had built her. And if she could read Orth Vane, then Sailor Rourke knew things about the shape of this campaign that Veth, a sub-commander of 9 years' loyal service, had been carefully arranged never to know. He began, without admitting to himself that he was doing it, to watch the counselor. Orth Vane was pleased, and displeasure would have been safer. He allowed himself to know this in the privacy of the stratagem, the small high chamber above the command dome, where the Directorate did its thinking away from soldiers. The war was turning. Not one, he was too disciplined to think one, but turning, for the first time in 9 years, and turning on an instrument that was his. The fleet master believed he was winning his own battles. The captains believed the tide had shifted. Only Orth and the Iridect, who served the Directorate rather than the fleet, knew that the tide was a girl in a recovery cell 3 decks down, and that the girl was the smaller half of what she was for. He stood before the stratagem's deep display and let it show him the true campaign, the one beneath the war. The Thren were the war. The Thren had always been the war, and breaking them at the Marrow Gap would end the war, and ending the war would make Orth Vane the strategist who ended the war, which was worth a great deal. But a strategist who thought only as far as winning was a tactician with delusions. Orth thought past the war to the shape of the peace, and the shape of the peace had a problem in it, and the problem was the verge. The human worlds were rising. Slowly, crudely from the galactic margins, the verge stock were building ships and reaching outward, and the Directorate's own projections, sober, conservative, unwelcome, put them at parity with the conquered's frontier within 2 generations and past it within 4. The medical cast's work on the girl had turned that from an abstraction into a horror. Because if a single sampled human, a hazard analyst from a rescue station, could be opened up into the thing on the command ring, if that was what lay dormant in the coarse gray matter of the average verge stock, then the conquered was not looking at a rival. It was looking at a successor. Unless the successor could be shown, decisively and publicly, to be a weapon so dangerous that the civilized galaxy had no choice but to contain its source. That was the second half. That was the campaign beneath the campaign. Break the Thren at the Marrow Gap with the humans' reeds. And then, with the fleet already massed at the Marrow approaches, and the human relief flotilla already inbound to reclaim its lost convoy, let the same fleet and the same instrument intercept that flotilla and destroy it, not in ambush, but demonstrably, with the humans' own predictive reeds guiding every shot, so that the record would show a single augmented human outthinking and annihilating a formation of her own kind. Present that record to the conquered Directorate. Let the horror do the rest. The verge would be quarantined not as a punishment, but as a quarantine. The medical cast's sampling program made policy, and Orth Vane would be the strategist who did not merely end a war but saw the next one coming and strangled it in the cradle. The girl was the weapon, and the girl was the proof, and the girl, when it was done, was the first specimen of a managed resource. He had told no one the whole of it. The fleet master knew only that there was a contingency at the Marrow approaches. The captains knew nothing. The Iridect knew their part, which was the cradles, the extra berths being fitted 3 decks below the girl's cell for the specimens that would follow her. Compartmentalization was the first discipline of a counselor. A plan known in full by more than one mind was a plan with more than one mind that could betray it. Orth watched the campaign turn in the deep display and was pleased, and told himself the small cold thing he had felt on the command ring. The girl's flat voice saying you should tell them you're going to keep me for the whole campaign. the sense of a floor shifting, was the ordinary unease of a man who has built a very sharp tool and knows it has an edge on both sides. He was wrong about that, but he was a disciplined man, and disciplined men are the easiest of all to predict because they mistake their discipline for unpredictability. Sayla built her picture out of things she was not supposed to be able to see. She was never given a map of the campaign. She was given battles, one at a time, and told to read them, and between battles she was returned to a warm cell with a false window and monitored for her health. But a battle is not a closed thing. A battle trails supply behind it and orders ahead of it, and the whole of it sits inside a fleet that is itself a pattern. And Sayla could no more read a battle without reading its edges than a person can hear one word of a sentence and not the ones on either side. So she read the edges. She read them in the fuel the fleet burned and the fuel it hoarded. A fleet fighting to break the Thren at the Marrow Gap and go home would burn its reserves toward the gap. This fleet was staging depots wide of the gap. At the Marrow approaches, on the vector, she had checked this 3 times, because it was the kind of thing she needed to be certain of. On the vector, a formation would use to intercept something coming in from human space. She read it in the medical cast's requisitions, which crossed a maintenance feed she had learned to parse. Berths, cradles, the specific low-temperature cabling the Iridect had used on her own recovery shelf, 3 decks below her and multiplying. One of her was a Triumph. 12 cradles was a program. She read it in the way Orith Vane spoke to the fleet master, the careful architecture of what he left unsaid, a man building a house and letting everyone see only the room they stood in. And she read it most of all in herself, because she knew what she was for. A weapon that reads battles does not need to be paraded on a command ring and named and shown to captains. You keep a weapon like that quiet. You do not build a legend around it unless the legend is the point. Unless you need at the end a record that everyone will believe, a story with a face, a single terrible human who outthought a fleet. They were not hiding her. They were introducing her. That was the tell that closed it. She was not being used to win a war. She was being made into evidence. The last piece came on the 16th day in the navigation feed, the human formation she had glimpsed once already, closer now, resolving. Small, undergunned, careful. The Kestrel flotilla, the transponder said, when she finally got a clean read on it. A relief element out of the Halden yards, 7 ships, come to find a lost convoy. Come to find her, and the 400 others the Conquered had swept up at the Marrow approaches and never mentioned to anyone, because the convoy had not been a convoy of soldiers. It had been families, colonists. Her own people, whom the Iridect had sampled and found mostly too coarse and warehoused anyway, 3 decks below her, on the other side of a wall she had not been meant to know was there. Sayla lay in the warm cell and ran it forward and found, again, the 9th move where it broke, and this time she made herself look at the 2 ships she would have to spend to reach it, and at the picket crew aboard them, and she looked until the looking stopped moving, and then she began, very quietly, to build the sequence that would let a fleet win the war it wanted while losing the war it was hiding. It could not be done by refusing. She had run refusing forward 100 ways. If she refused to read, they would dampen her. Osk had the means. She had read it in his hands, a way to close the door in her head partway, to make her the warming-up instrument they still half believed she was. And then they would win the war more slowly and do the second thing anyway, without her reads to make it clean, and the Kestrel flotilla would die messily instead of surgically, and the record would be built out of some other human's mind, because there were 12 cradles and there would be more. Refusing killed her people and did not stop the plan. She had put that hope down early. It could not be done by fighting. She was one small human 3 decks inside a flagship with a monitoring lens in the corner and a tether when they walked her. She had run fighting forward too. Fighting ended in the dampening or worse, and did not stop the plan either. The only way to stop the plan was to win it. To give Orith Vane exactly the victory he wanted, the whole of it, the Thren broken at the Marrow Gap, the fleet massed and triumphant, and to build that victory, move by move, out of her own reeds, so that when the moment came for the second half, the fleet would already be standing in the one shape from which the second half could not be given as a quiet order in a compartment, but only as a loud one in the open. In front of every captain and warden and Thren armistice observer, whose belief the whole plan depended on. To make the double-cross a thing that could only happen in daylight, in front of the people who would never allow it. And to make certain that the record, the cradles, the sampling program, the evidence of what had been done to her and was being done below her, ended the campaign in the hands of someone who was not Orith Vane. That was 9 moves deep, and it required her to be trusted absolutely. And it required Orith to believe he was using her right up until the instant he discovered she had been using him. And it required a conquered officer she had spoken to exactly never to make a choice she could not make for him. She had already picked the officer, the one with the wrong-shaped eyes, who saw what she saw and was ashamed of it. She had 11 days of reads on Veth Oma, and she knew the shape of him the way she knew the shape of a storm front, what he would do under pressure, where his loyalty ran and where it frayed, the exact weight of proof it would take to move him. She had not spoken to him. Speaking to him would be a move, and moves were watched. She was saving him for last. Sayla closed her eyes, which did nothing, and began. Orith Vane set a trap for his own instrument on the 19th day, because a strategist who does not test his weapons is a strategist waiting to be surprised by them. He did it cleanly. He had the tactical section prepare a false engagement, a training simulation dressed as a live feed, a Thren thrust into the Conquered's coreward flank that had never happened, built with enough fidelity to fool a tactician and fed to the command ring as real. Then he had Sayla brought up and asked her to read it. If she read the false battle as real, she was an instrument, blind past her inputs, exactly as safe as he needed her to be. If she saw through it, if she recognized that no such battle was occurring, then she was reading past her inputs, reading the fleet, reading him, and Orith would know that the small cold feeling on the command ring 19 days ago had been a warning and not an indigestion. He watched her from the stratagem's high gallery, unseen, through the deep display's mirror of the ring below. Sayla came up on the tether, stood in the daylight, and looked at the false battle for what Orith's own instruments measured as 11 seconds longer than her usual read, but not remarkably longer. Then she said, in the flat drilled voice, "Coreward thrust is a committed push, not a feint. They've weighted the second echelon too heavy for a feint. If you slide the reserve wing up the coreward high quarter, you take them in the throat before they set. Move in the next 2 minutes, or you're reacting instead of acting." It was a competent read of a battle that did not exist. Orith felt the floor under him settle back to solid. She was an instrument. She read what she was given and did not question whether it was real, because questioning whether reality was real was not a thing the medical caste had built into her. And "One thing," Sayla said. Orith went still. "The feed's clean," she said. She had gone back to watching the false plate, her voice unhurried. "Too clean. Real Thren coreward pushes come in dirty, sensor ghosting off the coreward dust, packet loss on the far picket relays, the lag you always get bouncing signal around the near star. This one's got none of it. If it were real, I'd trust it less. Since it's a drill, I read it straight." A small pause, no longer than a breath. "You wanted to know if I could tell. I can tell. I read it straight anyway because you asked me to read it, and a good instrument reads what it's given." She turned her head, unhurried, and looked up, not at the ring, at the gallery, at the exact point of the mirror behind which Orith stood, which she could not have seen and had located anyway. "That's the answer to your question, counselor. Both halves of it." The command ring did not understand what had happened. The fleet master thought the human had made a strange remark about signal quality. Only Orith, in the high gallery, understood that his instrument had just told him, in front of a room that could not follow, that she knew it was a test, that she knew who was testing her, that she had chosen to pass it, and that she wanted him to know she had chosen. A lesser strategist would have panicked. Orith had not risen to counselor by panicking. He stood in the gallery and made himself think coldly all the way through. The instrument reads past its inputs. It reads the fleet. It may read the campaign. Therefore it may know the second half. This was the worst case, and Orith made himself sit inside the worst case until it stopped frightening him, because of fear you have sat inside stops driving your hands. Assume she knows everything. What can she do about it? She was one human, restrained, monitored, 3 decks deep in his flagship, with no allies, no access, no weapon but a voice that told him true things about battles. Her only power was her reads, and her reads were his. She could not give a false read without his tacticians eventually catching the divergence against the real feed, and a caught false read would end her usefulness and her life in the same hour. She was a caged thing whose only tool was honesty. Knowing his plan changed nothing, because knowing was not the same as being able to act, and she could not act. And there was a use in her knowing. A weapon that understands the whole of its purpose and continues to serve is a weapon you can trust further than one that is merely blind. She had just told him she would read straight because he asked her to. She had shown him her leash by declining to test it. That was not the behavior of a thing planning betrayal. That was the behavior of a thing that had done the arithmetic on its own situation and concluded, correctly, that service was survival. Orith Vane decided that his instrument was more valuable than he had known, and no more dangerous than he could manage, and he went down from the gallery satisfied. And this was the single largest error of his disciplined life, and he had made it exactly where Sailor Rourke had put the bait. Chirurgeon Prime Osk came to her cell that evening, as he came most evenings, to measure how the augmented structures were settling, and Sailor let him, because his visits were data, and because the surgeon was a piece she had not yet finished reading. He was, she had decided, the most dangerous kind of good creature, the kind that has never once had to notice the cost of what he does, because his work has always been called healing, and he has always believed the word. He sat across from her on the fold-down stool the Iridect used for examinations, and he ran his gentle instruments over the healed lines on her scalp, and he narrated his own hands the way he always did, in the absorbed voice of a craftsman pleased with his materials. "The integration is remarkable," Osk said. "Do you understand what you are, Sailor Rourke? I ask because I am not certain even the counselor understands it, and he commissioned you. Your species carries, in the deep folds of its brain, structures that evolved to keep a small, soft animal alive on a world that was trying every hour to kill it, structures for reading threat, reading weather, reading the intention of a predator from the twit of its shoulder, 100,000 years before your kind built its first fire. Most sapient species lost those structures when their worlds grew safe. Yours never did, because your world never grew safe. We did not give you your gift. We only took the walls off a thing your Deathworld built into you and then buried under everything you learned afterward. I find it beautiful." His antennae moved, pleased. "I have sampled 400 of your convoy. You are the finest by a wide margin, but you are not unique. That is the part the counselor understands, and I am only beginning to. What we found in you is in your species. We merely found it first." "You found it first," Sailor agreed, in the tired, grateful voice she used with him, "and you think that makes you safe." Osk paused, his instrument still against her scalp. "Safe from what?" "From what you found." She let him see nothing on her face. She had learned to give him exactly the readings he expected. "You keep telling me I'm fortunate. You keep telling me I'm beautiful. You've never once told me you're afraid, and you should be, because you built a thing that reads predators from the twitch of a shoulder, and then you spend an hour a day sitting close enough to touch it, narrating your hands." She looked at him. "I'm not threatening you, Chirurgeon. I'm telling you what you made. You took the walls off a threat treater and you've been treating it like a microscope. A microscope doesn't read the person holding it. I do, every evening. I've read you down to the floor, and the thing I've read is that you have never in your life let yourself feel the weight of what your gentle hands have done, because gentle hands are the ones that never have to. That's not an accusation. It's a measurement. You wanted to know if I understand what I am. I understand it better than you understand what you are, and I understand what you are completely. Osk withdrew his instrument slowly, and for a moment the absorbed craftsman's calm flickered, and under it Sayla read the first thin thread of the thing she had been waiting 19 days to find in him, not cruelty. There was no cruelty in Osk, but the beginning of the question a gentle man spends his whole life not asking, the question of what his gentleness has been in service of. It was a small thread. She noted it and folded it into the sequence, because a gentle man who has begun to ask the question is a gentle man who can, at the right hour, on an open channel, be made to be the picture that turns a fleet. You should be afraid, she said again, quietly, almost kindly, because it was true and because she needed him to remember she had said it. Not of me. Of the day you find out the microscope was reading you the whole time. Go on with your measurements, Chirurgeon. I'm healing beautifully. You said so yourself. Osk finished his measurements with hands that were, for the first time in his long decorated career, not entirely steady, and logged that the subject's integration was remarkable and her effect cooperative, and did not log the thing she had put into him, because he did not yet have a word for it, and he went away to think, which was exactly what she had needed him to begin doing. The engagements went on, and Sayla read them further ahead each day, not because the door was opening wider. It was already open all the way, but because she was letting the fleet see a little more of the depth each day, teaching them to trust reads that reached 4 moves out, then 5, then the whole shape of an enemy campaign, because the sequence needed them reckless with her reads at the marrow gap, and recklessness had to be built like anything else. One exceeded expectation at a time. She read a Thren supply run 3 days before it happened and let the fleet gut it. She read a feigned Thren defection and kept the fleet from swallowing the poison inside it. She read, once, an entire Thren fleet movement off nothing but the pattern of which relay stations had gone quiet, and Drod, who had begun to speak of her to his captains as though she were a weather instrument he had personally calibrated, committed his heavy elements on her word alone and won a battle he never fought, and did not notice that a fleet which commits its heavy elements on one voice's word is a fleet being taught a habit, and that habits, once taught, can be spent. Veth noticed. Veth noticed everything now, because he had stopped sleeping, and a man who has stopped sleeping has a great many quiet hours to watch. He watched the fleet learn to lean on the reed the way a tired man learns to lean on a rail, and he watched the rail take more weight each day, and he thought about what it would mean if the rail ever decided to move, and he found the wall on the 21st day, and it was a real wall on a real deck, and it was the wall that told him the rest was real too. He had been careful. He had told himself for a week that watching the counselor was diligence, and then he had stopped telling himself that and started keeping a record, and a sub-commander who keeps a private record of a counselor is a sub-commander who has already, somewhere under his own notice, chosen a side. He did not know yet what the side was. He knew only that the shape of the campaign had a room in it he could not see into, and that not being able to see into a room was, in his long experience, the thing that killed you. He found the wall by following the requisitions. He was a tactical officer. Supply was his native tongue, and the fleet's supply had begun to speak in a dialect he did not recognize. Fuel staged wide of the marrow gap, at the approaches, on a vector that pointed at nothing the Thren held. Medical requisitions, running through a directorate channel that bypassed the fleet's own chirurgeons, low-temperature cabling, structural berths, quantities that made no sense for a fleet that carried its wounded in the ordinary way. He traced the medical requisitions to a section of the flagship's 3rd medical deck that the manifest listed as reclamation storage, and he went there, on a shift when the corridors were thin, because he was a sub-commander and no one stopped a sub-commander walking his own ship. The reclamation storage was sealed behind a directorate lock, and through the lock's narrow observation slit Veth Oma looked into a long daylit chamber the Irideck kept warm and saw the berths, rows of them. Cradles, cabled and cold and waiting, built to the shape of a body he had seen exactly twice as corpses being catalogued. Human births, not one, not for the girl he had watched on the ring. Many, a program's worth. And past them, behind a second wall, he heard through the deck plating the sound he would not afterward be able to unhear. Living sound. The shift and murmur of a great many people held quietly in a place they had not chosen, on the other side of a manifest that called them reclamation storage. Veth stood at the observation slit for a long time. Then he went back to his quarters and sat in the dark he had not bothered to light and understood several things in a row. The way a man understands the tide has turned by noticing his boots are already wet. The girl was not a war winner the Directorate had found. She was the first of a crop the Directorate was growing. The wide-staged fuel did not point at the Thren because it was not for the Thren. The campaign had a room he could not see into, and the room was full of his own fleet's people building cradles for a species. And the girl on the command ring, the small human who read battles 9 years faster than he did, knew. Of course she knew. She read everyone. She had read this on the first day, standing in the daylight saying you should tell them you're going to keep me for the whole campaign, and she had been telling Orth Vane, in a language only the two of them spoke, that she saw the whole of it. And she had gone on reading his battles anyway, day after day, winning his war for him because what? Veth turned it over in the dark, because she had no choice, because refusing killed her, because a caged thing serves. That was the obvious answer, and Veth, who had spent 9 years learning that the Thren's obvious moves were the ones that killed you, did not trust it. He thought about the way she read the Fleet Master, the way she had said Drod would order the pursuit and then cancel it and tell himself the report was why, and then Drod had ordered the pursuit and canceled it and told himself the report was why. She did not merely predict the enemy. She predicted the room. She predicted the men who held her leash as easily as she predicted the men who shot at the fleet. A thing that can predict the room is not caged, Veth thought slowly in the dark. It is only waiting. He did not sleep that night either. Toward the pale start of the next daylit cycle, watching the blue world turn outside his port, Sub-Commander Veth Oma admitted to himself the thing he had been circling for a week. That somewhere in the campaign the girl was running. There was a move that had his name on it, that she had read him the way she read everyone, that she was saving him for something, and that when it came he would have to decide, in whatever narrow window she left him, whether 9 years of loyalty to a conquered that built cradles was loyalty at all. He did not know it yet, but she had already decided he would decide right. She had read that too. It was the only part of the whole sequence she had allowed herself to be certain of, because it was the only part she could not afford to be wrong about. The fleet reached the outer Marrow on the 24th day, and the war began, at last, to end. The Thren knew what the Marrow Gap was worth. It was the one corridor through which a fleet could reach the coreward conquered worlds without a 2-year burn around the drift, and for 9 years neither side had been able to hold it. And now the conquered came into the outer Marrow with a fleet that had stopped losing, and the Thren massed to break it, and both sides understood that whatever was decided in the gap would decide the war. Orth Vane had chosen the ground and Sailorurk had built the approach, read by read, engagement by engagement, feeding the Fleet Master a campaign so clean that Drod had begun to believe he was a great captain who had merely been unlucky for 9 years. She fed them the war they wanted. She was precise about it. She did not merely predict the Thren now. She shaped the Conquered's moves so that the fleet arrived at the outer Marrow in a particular disposition, spread along the approaches. Its heavy elements weighted toward the wide-staged fuel depots, the depots that pointed at the human vector, because that was where Orth wanted his strength for the second half, and Sayla wanted Orth to have exactly what Orth wanted. Every read she gave served the war and served the plan and served, underneath both, in a way no one but Sayla could see, the sequence. Because a fleet spread along the Marrow approaches in the shape Orth wanted, was a fleet spread too wide to be commanded quietly. Orith's second half depended on compartments, on a contingency order given to a few trusted captains, executed before the rest of the fleet understood, the human flotilla destroyed, and the record made before anyone could object. But a fleet spread along 30 light seconds of approaches, coordinating across the lag Sayla had spent a week teaching them to respect, could not act on a quiet order. To turn that fleet onto a new target in the window the human flotilla's arrival would allow, the order would have to go out loud, on the fleet-wide command channel, to every captain at once, in the open. Sayla had spent 24 days making Orith vain, strong in exactly the way that would force him, at the one moment that mattered, to be loud. He did not see it, because it looked like winning, and a man watching himself win does not check the shape of the victory for teeth. She saw the cost coming 3 days out. The Thren in the opening exchanges of the gap would throw a probing thrust at the Concorde's forward picket, a real one, not a feint, a committed jab to test the fleet's coordination, and the picket that took it would be the Sedaner squadron, 2 ships, 400 and some crew, and if Sayla read that thrust early and warned them, the picket would pull in live, and Orith's tacticians would see how far ahead she was reading and grow cautious with her, and cautious was the one thing she could not let them be. Because the sequence needed them reckless with her reads right up to the end. If she read it late, or shallow, or not at all, the picket would take the thrust and the 2 ships would die. She ran it forward every way there was. There was no branch where the Sedaner squadron lived, and the 400 colonists 3 decks down lived, and the Kestrel flotilla lived. There was only the branch where she spent the picket to buy the rest, and the branches where she saved the picket and lost everything. Sayla Rurk made herself look at the 2 ships until they stopped moving. Then she folded them into the sequence, and did not warn them, and this was the coldest thing she did. And she did it in a warm cell under a false window, alone, with no one to see the cost land on her but the monitoring lens in the corner, which recorded her lying perfectly still, and reported that the subject was resting well. The Thren came into the Marrow Gap at the 27th hour of the 24th day, and they opened, as Sayla had known they would, with a jab at the forward picket. Veth was on the ring when it happened. He watched the Sedaner squadron take the thrust, 2 ships, forward and exposed, the position the fleet's disposition had left them holding, and he watched the command ring wait for the read that would tell them how to save it, and the read did not come. Sayla was up on the tether in the daylight, watching the plate, and for 6 seconds she said nothing, and in those 6 seconds the Thren heavy element that had been sitting cold behind the near dust lit its drives and crossed the gap, and the Sedaner squadron's fate stopped being a question. "Sedaner is inside envelope," a tactician said, his voice climbing. "Read, we need the read. How do we pull them?" "You don't," Sayla said. The ring went rigid. Veth felt it in his own gut, the wrongness of it. The first time in 24 days the read had been a closed door instead of an open one. "They committed a heavy element to take those 2 ships," she said, flat, watching. "If you send anything to pull them, you send it into the same envelope, and you lose the rescue too, and worse, you show the Thren where your reserve strength is before the main engagement. Sedaner is gone. It's been gone since they crossed the dust. Everything you spend trying to save it, you're spending on a corpse. Hold your line. Let the heavy element overcommit. In a few minutes it's going to be out here in the open, alone, on the wrong side of the gap, and then it's yours." Drod's jaws worked. He was a soldier of the old kind. Leaving a picket to die violated something in him older than tactics. But he had believed the read for 24 days, and the read had made him a winner, and a winner does not stop believing at the first hard word. "You're certain?" "I'm certain," Sayla said, and Veth, watching her face, saw nothing move on it and understood later in the dark, he would understand, that the nothing was the tell, that a read delivered with nothing on the face was a read that had cost her something she was not going to show a room full of aliens. The Sedaner squadron died in the next 90 seconds, 2 ships and 400 and some crew, and the Thren-heavy element that killed them came out the far side of the kill exactly as she had said, overcommitted, alone, on the wrong side of the gap. Sayla read it dead in 4 sentences, and the conquered flank folded around it and finished it. And the fleet traded 2 ships for a heavy element in the opening exchange of the battle that would decide the war. And every officer on the ring understood that it was a good trade. And every officer on the ring was a little colder afterward for having made it. Veth Oma looked at the small human on the tether and thought, she spent them. She saw it coming 3 days out and she spent them on purpose for something. He did not yet know for what, but he had stopped believing she was a cage thing whose only tool was honesty, because a cage thing does not spend a picket. A cage thing begs for the picket. Only a commander spends one. He filed it and said nothing and began, though he would not have called it that yet, to wait for her move. The main engagement opened an hour later, and it was everything 9 years had been building toward, and Sayla Rourke ran it like a woman reading weather. The Thren had massed their full strength to hold the gap, and for the first hour it looked, to the tacticians, like the disaster the conquered had suffered a dozen times before, the Thren pressing on 3 faces, the fleet bending, the plate a churn of contacts no one could hold in their head. But Sayla held it in her head. She stood on the tether in the daylight and read it in long, flat sentences, and the sentences were always a little ahead of the plate, so that the fleet stopped reacting to what the Thren did and started arriving where the Thren were going to be. Their coreward push is the real one, the other 2 are pinning. Wait coreward. Not yet, they want you to commit early so they can shift the axis. Wait for the shift. There. Now wait coreward, all of it, they can't change the axis again without breaking their own coordination. A pause, eyes moving. They're going to break their own coordination trying. Let them. When their center gaps, it's going to gap on the low quarter in about 2 minutes. Put your heavy elements through the gap and cut their formation in half. Don't chase the halves. Halves die on their own. It went exactly as she said, because she was not guessing and she was not gaming branches. She was reading the one thing the Thren were, all the way down, and saying it out loud a little before they were it. The conquered fleet cut the Thren formation in half on the low quarter and the halves died on their own. And somewhere in the second hour, the battle stopped being a battle the conquered might lose and became a battle the conquered was winning. And then a rout. And the daylight of the pale blue world poured down through the command dome onto a plate that showed, for the first time in the memory of anyone on the ring, the Thren ascendancy coming apart. Fleet Master Drod Corvin watched his war end in his favor, and did not, in that hour, think about the 2 ships he had spent to buy it, because a winning commander's memory is merciful to him in exactly the places it should not be. Orith Vane watched from the stratagem gallery and thought about the second half. The battle was won. Not finished, there were hours of finishing left, the mopping up of broken Thren elements, the securing of the gap, but won decisively in a way the Directorate would understand as a war ended. And the fleet was exactly where he had wanted it. Spread along the Marrow approaches, its heavy elements weighted toward the wide-stage depots, triumphant, its officers flush with the unfamiliar warmth of victory, and disinclined to question the man whose instrument had delivered it. And the human relief flotilla, the Kestrel element, 7 ships out of the Halden yards, was inbound, closing, 4 hours out, coming to reclaim a convoy it did not know had been sampled and warehoused and turned into the first crop of a program. Everything was in place. Orith allowed himself, in the privacy of the gallery, the small cold satisfaction of a man watching a long sequence resolve. He would let the battle finish. He would let the fleet secure the gap. And then, when the Kestrel flotilla came into range, he would give the order, the contingency, the second target, the demonstration that would make the record, and his instrument would guide the fleet's fire against her own kind, and the horror of that record would remake conquered policy toward the verge for a generation. He watched the girl on the ring below, reading the death of the Thren in her flat, unhurried voice, and he felt something almost like fondness for her, the fondness a craftsman feels for a tool that has cut exactly true. She had known the whole of it. He was now certain, and she had served anyway, because service was survival and she was a rational instrument. In 4 hours she would serve the second half, and it would cost her something no rational instrument should be asked to bear, and Orith had made his peace with that, because a counselor who cannot spend his tools is a counselor with no tools to spend. He did not know that he had just thought, almost word for word, the thing Sailor Rourke had thought about the Sedaner Squadron 3 days before. He did not know that the whole of his campaign had been built, read by Reed, out of exactly the shape of certainty he was feeling now. He was a disciplined man watching himself win, and he did not check the shape of the victory for teeth. Sayla made her one move toward Veth Oma in the 3rd hour of the battle, and it was so small that no one but the two of them ever knew it happened. She had been walked up to the ring, as she was for every engagement, and she stood on the tether in the daylight reading the Thren apart, and the ring was full of officers and wardens and the churn of a battle being won, and in the middle of it she said to the room in the flat voice, a reed like all the others. Their broken coreward half is going to try to run the low approaches, the same approaches your depots are staged on. Send a sub-commander with a light element to shepherd the depots. Not a captain, you can't spare a captain, a sub-commander who knows supply, a pause no longer than a breath. Oma knows supply. Drod, in the warmth of winning, did not question it. It was a sensible read. The depots were valuable. A broken Thren element running the low approaches was a real threat, and Oma did no supply. He gave the order. Veth Oma took a light element of 3 ships down to the Marrow approaches to shepherd the wide-stage depots, and thought, as he went, that he had just been handed his move, and that he did not yet know what it was, and that the human had put him exactly where he needed to be to make it before he knew there was a move to make. He was right. When he reached the depots he found, on the manifest of the nearest one, a depot he had personally never requisitioned, staged through the directorate channel that bypassed the fleet's chirurgeons, the medical cast's cargo, not fuel, the cradles, the low-temperature cabling. And the record, the Iridex's own logs, the sampling data, the projections, the full architecture of the program, staged out here at the approaches because the directorate had wanted its evidence close to the demonstration that would make it policy, and because no one in the whole of Orith Vane's disciplined planning had imagined that the sub-commander sent to shepherd the depots would have any reason to open the manifest and read what he was guarding. Sayla had imagined it. Sayla had built it. She had spent 24 days arranging a battle so that, at the hour it was won, the one officer she had read to the bottom would be standing alone at the edge of the fleet, with the whole of the directorate's secret in his hands and 4 hours to decide what to do with it. Veth Oma stood in the hold of a supply depot at the edge of a one war and read the record of what his conquered had done and was going to do, and understood, at last and all at once, the move that had his name on it. She had not asked him to do anything. She had not spoken to him beyond a sensible battlefield read. She had simply moved him to the one place where he would have to choose, and left the choosing to him, because a choice a man makes himself is a choice he does not undo, and she had needed him not undone. He keyed his console with a hand that was steady, because a tactical officer's hands are steady even when the rest of him is not, and he began quietly to copy the record, all of it, every log, every projection into the buffers of his own 3 ships, where the directorate's channel could not reach it and the directorate's locks could not seal it, and where it would be, in 4 hours, exactly where Sayla Rourke had spent a war putting it, in the hands of someone who was not Orith Vane. Then he did the second thing, the thing she had not asked for and could not have ordered and had, he understood, gambled the whole sequence on him choosing for himself. He opened a secure channel to the 3 captains he trusted most in the fleet, men he had fought beside for 9 years, men who had also, he suspected, seen rooms in this campaign they could not see into. And he began, carefully, in the language soldiers use when they are deciding whether their loyalty and their orders are the same thing, to tell them what was in the depot. Sayla, 3 decks deep in the flagship, reading the pattern forward move after move, felt the sequence take the weight of his choice and hold. She did not know the words he used. She had not needed to. She had needed only to be right about the shape of him, and she had allowed herself to be certain of exactly one thing in the whole of her plan, and the one thing had held. She let out a breath that did nothing, because the patterns did not live in her breath, and she made herself look at the last part of the sequence, the part that was still 4 hours off and still cost more than she had shown anyone, and she waited for Orth Vane to be loud. The war ended, officially in the 4th hour, when the last coordinated Thren element broke and ran, and the Marrow Gap fell silent under the pale blue daylight, and the command ring of the Sethuns Reach did a thing Veth Oma had never in 9 years seen it do. It cheered. Sayla stood on the tether in the middle of the cheering and read the room, because she could not stop, and the room was joy, real joy, exhausted and disbelieving. 9 years of losing lifting off a fleet all at once, and she felt the joy of it land on her and slide off, because she was the only one in the daylight who knew that the war ending was not the end of anything. It was the 4th move of a 9-move sequence, and there were still 5 moves to run, and the next one belonged to Orth Vane. He came down from the stratagem gallery to stand on the ring for the victory, as a counselor should, and he accepted the fleet master's stiff acknowledgement and the captain's salutes across the channel, and he was gracious. And underneath the graciousness he was watching the plate's edge, where a formation of 7 small ships was closing on the Marrow approaches. 4 hours become 1, the Kestrel flotilla come to find its lost convoy. Chirurgeon Prime Osk found the counselor in the moment between the victory and the second half, in the short passage behind the command ring where the 2 of them could speak without the fleet hearing. "The subject is fatigued," Osk said, in the gentle, absorbed voice that never changed. 24 days of continuous reads, and today's engagement was the heaviest load we have ever placed on the augmented structures. I can dampen her, counselor, partially. Close the door in her head to a crack, enough that she remains an instrument for the demonstration but cannot exceed her inputs. It would be prudent. You have said yourself she reads past what we give her. Orth Vane considered it, and Sayla, 3 decks down, had already considered it for him, days ago, every way there was. "No," Orth said, because he needed the reeds sharp. Because the demonstration was the whole point, and a demonstration built out of a dampened instrument's clumsy fire was not a record that would remake policy. It was a slaughter, and slaughters did not frighten directorates, they embarrassed them. He needed the Kestrel flotilla destroyed the way the Thren had been destroyed, elegantly, a formation of humans outthought and dismantled by a single human mind reading 3 moves ahead, so that every counselor who watched the record would understand in their spine what an augmented human was and vote accordingly. A dampened instrument could not give him that. He needed her at the full, terrible edge of what the Iridect had made. "Keep her sharp," Orth said. "The record has to be clean. Bring her back to the ring for the second engagement." Osk inclined his blue chitinous head and went to fetch the instrument, and Orth Vane made, in that moment, the last of the certainties Sayla had built her sequence out of. He chose the sharp instrument over the safe one, because he wanted the clean record more than he feared the tool, and his greed for the perfect demonstration was the exact lever she had reached for, 9 moves back, in a warm cell under a false window. She had known he would not dampen her. She had built a war on it. They brought her up to the ring for the second time in 6 hours, and the daylight of the pale blue world poured down on a fleet that had won its war, and did not yet know it was about to be asked to commit a crime. Veth Oma was not on the ring. He was still out at the approaches with his 3 ships and his copied record and his 3 trusted captains, and he had spent the 4th hour the way Sayla had needed him to spend it, quietly, carefully, telling more captains, ship to ship, in the language soldiers use when they are deciding whether their orders and their honor are the same thing. He did not know the shape of what was coming. He knew only that a human relief flotilla was inbound, that his fleet was massed on a vector that pointed at it, that a depot at his back was full of cradles built for a species, and that the small human on the ring had put him here for a reason he was about to learn. He held his light element at the depots and watched the Kestrel flotilla close, and did the one thing a good tactical officer can always do while he waits, which was to make certain that, when the moment came, his captains were listening on a channel the Directorate did not control. The Kestrel flotilla came into range at the top of the 5th hour, and Orth Vane gave the order. He gave it the only way the disposition allowed him to give it. Sayla had seen to that, 24 days ago, spreading the fleet along 30 light seconds of approaches so that no quiet compartmented order could turn it in time. He gave it loud, on the fleet-wide command channel, to every captain at once, because that was the only channel that could coordinate a fleet spread that wide against a target closing that fast, and because he was a counselor at the moment of his triumph, and it did not occur to him, even then, that the shape of his own victory had been built to make him speak in the open. All elements, Directorate priority override, Orth said, and his voice was calm and it carried to every ship in the fleet. The inbound human formation is designated hostile under Directorate contingency. Fleet will engage and destroy. The Praxis subject will provide targeting reads. Weapons free on my mark. For 1 second the fleet-wide channel was silent. The silence of 200 captains who had just won a war against the Thren hearing themselves ordered to turn their guns on 7 small ships that had done nothing but come looking for their lost people. Sayla Rurk stood on the tether in the daylight and looked at the plate, where the Kestrel flotilla hung small and undergunned and unaware, and she did the thing she had spent 24 days and 400 lives and 1 picket squadron building the right to do. She read the battle. "Counselor wants a targeting read," she said, in the flat, unhurried voice to the whole ring, and through the open fleet-wide channel Orth himself had opened to every captain in the fleet. "Here it is. The inbound formation is 7 ships out of the Halden yards, a relief element undergunned unaware, coming to reclaim the colony convoy this fleet intercepted at the Marrow approaches 4 months ago. That convoy was 411 civilians. They're alive. They're in reclamation storage on the flagship's 3rd medical deck, 3 levels under where I'm standing, in cradles the medical cast built to sample them the way they sampled me. The order you just heard is not a war order. The war's over. This is the demonstration the whole campaign was built to make, a record of an augmented human destroying her own kind, so the Directorate can call the Verge a weapon and quarantine it. I'm the weapon and I'm the proof. That's the read, Counselor, all of it. You asked for it sharp." The fleet-wide channel did not stay silent after that. Orth Vane had wargamed betrayal 100 ways, and in none of them had the instrument simply told the truth on an open channel. He recovered in under a second because he was a disciplined man and a strategist under attack does not feel, he moves. His first move was the correct one, the one any competent counselor would make, sever her credibility before it could set. "The subject is compromised," Orth said, calm, carrying to the fleet-wide channel. "Thren deception protocols. They have been trying to turn our instrument for weeks. Chirurgeon, dampen the subject at once, close it down." He did not raise his voice. Raising his voice would have conceded that there was something to be afraid of. "Fleet will disregard the subject's transmission. Weapons free on the inbound formation. My mark stands." It was a good move. Against any opponent who had not read him, it might have held the word of a counselor against the word of a human weapon, the reflex of a fleet trained to obey the Directorate. Osk, on the medical deck, keyed the dampening sequence, his blue chitinous hands moving in the gentle, absorbed rhythm they always moved in, and 3 decks up Sayla felt the door in her head begin, slowly, to close. She had known it would. She had built the sequence so that by the time it did, it would not matter. Dampen me, she said, while she still could, flat and unhurried before the door narrowed past speech. It won't recall the transmission. It won't empty the depot. Subcommander Oma is holding at the Marrow approaches with 3 ships and a copy of the Iridex's own record, the sampling logs, the projections, the contingency directives in the counselor's own hand. He's had it for 4 hours. Ask him, Fleet Master. The dampening only proves you'd rather I couldn't talk. The door in her head closed to a crack, and Sayla Rourke went quiet on the tether. An instrument returned to its inputs, and it was the last move she made in the whole affair, and it was a move she had made 4 hours before she made it. Because the dampening was not a defeat. The dampening was the corroboration. A fleet that had just heard a human weapon accuse a counselor watched that counselor's first act be to silence her, and every captain on the channel understood the shape of that. Because soldiers understand the shape of a man who answers an accusation by cutting out the tongue that made it. Fleet Master Drod Corvine understood it best of all. He had not known the whole of it. That was the thing Orith had never grasped about compartmentalization. It protected the plan, but it also meant that the fleet's own commander had spent a picket squadron and won a war believing he was ending a war, and not one word of the second half had been his. Now he stood on his own command ring in the daylight and heard his instrument accuse a counselor, and heard the counselor silence her, and the 2 ships he had left to die at the gap turned over in his memory and stopped being a good trade. Subcommander Oma, Drod said, and his voice on the channel was very low and very careful, the voice of an old soldier holding something down. You're on the approaches. Confirm the subject's transmission. Do you have the record? I have it, Fleet Master. Veth's voice came back steady from the edge of the fleet. I'm transmitting it now. All elements on my authority as tactical subcommander, read it yourselves. Don't take mine or the counselor's word for any of it. Read it. The Iridex record went out across the fleet-wide channel. 4 hours of Veth Oma's careful copying poured into 200 command decks at once. The sampling logs, the cradle manifests, the directorate projections that put the Verge at parity in 2 generations, and the contingency directives in Orith Vane's own hand. The second target, the demonstration, the whole architecture of the campaign beneath the campaign. It could not be recalled. It could not be sealed. Sayla had spent 24 days making certain it would end this hour in the hands of someone who was not Orith Vane, and Veth Oma had spent 4 hours making certain that, when it did, it would go not to 1 man but to 200. Orith watched his secret become common knowledge across his own fleet and made his second move, because a strategist does not stop moving. The record is genuine, he said, and the calm did not crack, because conceding a fact you cannot deny is stronger than defending it. I will not insult this fleet by pretending otherwise. Yes, the Directorate has a contingency for the Verge. Yes, the human worlds are rising, and yes, what the medical cast found in this one subject is what lies dormant in all of them. You have all watched her for 24 days. You have watched her read this fleet, read the enemy, read me. Now imagine 10,000 of her, unaugmented, breeding at the margins of the galaxy, reaching for the core. The contingency is not a crime. It is a mercy the galaxy will thank us for in 100 years. The flotilla out there is 7 ships. What we prevent by ending it is a war none of you will survive. Weapons free. That is not a counselor's order now. That is the truth of the situation, and you are soldiers and you know it. It was, Veth would think later, a genuinely good argument delivered by a genuinely intelligent man, and it was the exact argument Sayla had predicted he would make, and she had answered it 4 hours ago by choosing which officer would be standing at the depot when the record broke. Because Orith's argument had a hole in it, and the hole was standing at the Marrow approaches with 3 ships and had just spent 4 hours reading the record he was defending. You're asking us to believe, Veth said slowly into the channel, that 411 colonists in cradles on the 3rd medical deck are a mercy. I'm looking at the manifest, counselor, families. The youngest sampled subject is 9 years old. You didn't intercept a warship. You intercepted people looking for a home, and you warehoused them, and you were going to kill their rescuers with one of their own daughters so the Directorate would let you do it to the rest." He paused, and when he spoke again his voice had gone flat, and it was, Sayla would have recognized, the exact register she used when a thing had cost her something. "I've fought for the Conquered for 9 years. I've spent good crews holding the line for it. I held the line because I believed the line was worth holding. That, the record, the cradles, the 9-year-old in a cradle, is not the line. Fleet Master, I will not fire on the flotilla, and I'm moving my element to interpose. Any captain who feels the way I do, the flotilla's on the low approaches and it's going to need a screen." And the thing happened that Orth Vane, for all his discipline, had never modeled, because it was not a thing a strategist can model. It was a thing that can only be read, and only one mind in the marrow had been built to read it. Ships began to move. Not all of them, not most at first. But Veth Oma had spent 4 hours on the ship-to-ship channels the Directorate did not control, telling captains what was in the depot, and those captains had spent 4 hours sitting with it. And when the record broke across the fleet-wide channel, it did not land on them cold. It landed on ground he had already turned. 3 captains he trusted came off the line and turned for the low approaches. Then a 4th, who had lost kin to the Thren and did not intend to spend the peace killing families. Then a squadron whose commander had walked the 3rd medical deck once and been turned away from a door marked reclamation storage and never stopped wondering. The fleet did not mutiny. Fleets do not mutiny cleanly. But it came apart along exactly the seam Sayla had read in it 24 days ago. The seam between the soldiers who fought for the Conquered and the counselor who fought for the Directorate. And the seam ran, in the end, right through the daylight of the command dome, where Fleet Master Drod Corvin stood between the 2 halves of his own fleet, and understood that the next thing he said would decide which half he was. Drod Corvin had spent 40 years learning that a commander's worst moments are the quiet ones, the ones with no enemy in them, where the only thing shooting at you is a choice. He looked at the plate. The fleet he had led for 9 years was coming apart along a seam, a third of it already turning for the low approaches to screen 7 small human ships, the rest holding the line and waiting to be told what the line was now. He looked at Orth Vane, calm in the daylight, 4 hands folded in the scholar's rest, a man who had used him, used his fleet, used his war, used the 2 ships that died at the gap as the outer casing of a crime. And he looked at the tether, where the small human stood gone quiet and inward, dampened, an instrument switched down, and he thought about the 24 days she had spent handing him victories he had believed were his own, and about the 6 seconds on the ring when she had said you don't and let a picket die, and he understood, at last, what those 6 seconds had cost her and what she had bought with them. She had bought this. She had bought a fleet standing at a seam with a choice in front of it, in the daylight, where the choice could not be hidden. She had spent his 2 ships to buy his fleet the chance to be better than the men who owned it. It was the coldest gift Drod had ever been given, and he was old enough to know a gift when it cut him. "Counselor Vane," Drod said. He did not raise his voice either, he had learned that from watching her. "You gave a Directorate priority override. I'm a fleet master. On my own deck in my own fleet in the field, my command supersedes a Directorate priority when I judge it unlawful under the articles I swore to. I judge it unlawful." He turned his head a degree toward comms. "Belay the override. All elements weapons safe. The inbound flotilla is not hostile. Subcommander Oma, hold your screen. You're now the flotilla's escort on my authority. And put a warden detail on the counselor." He's relieved. It should have ended there. Against a lesser man it would have. But Orth Vane was not a lesser man, and a strategist relieved of command is still a strategist, and he had one move left that he had built for exactly this. The move a disciplined man always builds, the one that turns his own defeat into a weapon. "You misunderstand the situation, Fleet Master," Orth said, and for the first time there was something under the calm, not fear, but the cold satisfaction of a man reaching for a lever he had hidden well. You think the demonstration was the plan. The demonstration was the clean version of the plan. There is a courier drone in the stratagem, sealed under Directorate Cipher, and it launched for the Coreward Directorate the moment I gave the override. It carries the record, the true record, the one I wrote, and the record it carries says that at the Marrow Gap an augmented human subject seized a conquered fleet, turned its captains against their own command, and interposed it between the Directorate and a human incursion. Everything that has happened in this dome for the last 4 minutes is in that record. You have not stopped the demonstration. You have performed it. The Directorate will not see a counselor's crime. It will see exactly what I promised them, a single augmented human outthinking a fleet and bending it to her will. You have made the Verge look like the most dangerous thing in the galaxy, Fleet Master, and you did it on an open channel in front of 200 witnesses. The quarantine writes itself now. You've all signed it. The daylight poured down through the dome onto a command ring that had gone very still, because the counselor was right, and every officer on the channel could feel that he was right. The record of the last 4 minutes was worse for the Verge than the demonstration would have been. A human weapon proven able to turn a fleet, and it was already gone, launched, uncatchable, and there was nothing anyone in the Marrow could do to recall a drone under Directorate Cipher. Sailor Rourke stood dampened on the tether and could not speak, and did not need to, because she had read the courier drone 11 days ago in the stratagem's power draw, and she had folded it into the sequence, and the answer to it had been standing at the Marrow approaches for 4 hours with 3 ships and a copy of a record. Veth Oma answered it, because she had put him where he could. There's a second record, Counselor, Veth said, from the edge of the fleet, and his voice was steady. I've been transmitting it for 4 minutes, wideband, uncoded, to every ship in this fleet and to the inbound flotilla and out along the Coreward relay chain in clear, not under cipher, in the open, where anyone can read it and everyone will. Your courier carries your version to the Directorate. Mine's already there, the sampling logs, the cradle manifests, the contingency in your own hand, the 9-year-old on the 3rd medical deck. By the time your drone arrives, half the Conquered will have read what the Marrow fleet found in the dark, and the Directorate won't be deciding whether to quarantine the Verge. It'll be deciding how to survive what its own counselor did in its name. A pause. You built a record to prove the Verge was too dangerous to live free. You didn't get the record you built. You got the one where a fleet of your own people read what you'd done and refused. That record doesn't quarantine the Verge, Counselor. It ends the program. And it ends you. Orith Vane was silent for a long moment in the daylight, and Sayla, watching him through the crack that was all the Iridect had left her, read the last of him. The strategist running the pattern forward, move after move, looking for the branch where he still won and not finding it. There was no branch. She had spent 24 days making certain there was no branch. Every read she had given him had been a wall going up around exactly this room, and he had helped her build it, brick by brick, because each brick had looked like a victory. There was one branch left, and Orith Vane reached for it, because a strategist does not concede while a single branch remains, however narrow. He had kept a piece back. It was the oldest discipline he had, older than compartmentalization, the reserve you never commit and never mention, the hidden element off the edge of the plate that turns a lost position in one move. 3 Directorate cutters, fast and lightly seen, held dark and silent on the high approaches since before the battle began, logged to no one's command but his, waiting for exactly the kind of hour a strategist keeps a hidden reserve against. They did not need the fleet. They did not need an override the captains would refuse. They needed only a firing solution on 7 undergunned human ships, and a fait accompli, a flotilla dead in the daylight, guns still hot, because a dead flotilla was a demonstration whether or not the fleet had wanted it, and a demonstration was all Orith had ever needed. He gave the order on the sealed Directorate channel the fleet could not hear, 3 words, and the 3 cutters lit their drives on the high approaches and swung for the low quarter where the flotilla hung unaware. And for one heartbeat, Orth Vane had his branch, the single narrow line where he still won. The cutters came around onto their firing run and found the arc closed. There was a ship in it. 3 ships, Veth Oma's light element. The screen he had moved to the low approaches an hour ago on a battlefield read that had said send a sub-commander who knows supply. Sitting exactly across the one lane, the high-approach cutters could reach the flotilla through, as though they had been placed there a day in advance to mask a threat no one but Orth had known existed. They had. Sayla had read the hidden reserve the way she had read the courier drone, 11 days back, in a power signature that did not belong to any element the fleet admitted to owning. 3 cutters' worth of drives held cold on the high approaches, logged to no command she could see, which meant a command that did not want to be seen, which meant a strategist's kept reserve. She had folded it into the sequence with everything else. The screen she had sent Veth to hold was not only interposed between the fleet and the flotilla. It was interposed precisely along the single firing lane a high approach element would have to use, because she had known there was a high approach element, and had put Veth's 3 ships across its throat 24 days before it lit its drives. The cutters had no solution. To make one they had to come around the screen, into the daylight, into the plate, in full view of a fleet that had already turned, and the instant they did, they stopped being a hidden reserve and became 3 directorate ships maneuvering to murder a rescue flotilla in front of 200 witnesses, and a record already broadcast in clear. Their commander, whoever he was, did the arithmetic a hidden reserve is never supposed to have to do in the open, and found that the fait accompli was gone the moment the accompli required daylight, and held his fire, and hung there on the low approaches with his drives hot and nothing to shoot, a last branch that had been cut off at the root a day before it grew. Drod Corvin saw the 3 cutters appear on the plate, ships he had not known were in his own battle space, held dark under a counselor's private cipher through the whole of the engagement, and something in the old soldier's face closed like a hatch. A hidden reserve in his own fleet, logged to no command of his, kept for a murder. It was, of everything the record had shown him, the thing that landed hardest, because it was the one thing he could read without a single line of documentation. A counselor who had sat on his command ring for 24 days and kept 3 ships secret from him against exactly this hour. "Those aren't mine," Drod said, very quietly, to no one. And it was the moment he stopped being a fleet master who had been used and became a fleet master who had decided, and every captain on the channel heard the difference in it. Orth Vane watched his final piece die against a screen placed before the game had visibly begun, and understood completely what had been done to him. He had not been beaten in this room in this hour by a fleet that turned. He had been beaten 24 days ago, read by Reed. Every hidden reserve and courier drone and compartmented order anticipated and answered and built into the shape of a victory he had walked into believing it was his. The girl had not fought him. She had known that a strategist of his discipline would keep a reserve on the high approaches, would launch a courier under cipher, would silence his accuser first and argue second and reach for a fait accompli last. And she had stood a piece in front of each one before he ever moved it, and then she had waited, in a warm cell under a false window, for him to move them exactly as his nature required. He found at the end the only move a cornered strategist has left, which is to understand that he has lost and to decide how to be seen losing. "The subject reads past its inputs," Orth said, quietly, almost to himself, in the tone of a man completing a proof. He was looking at Sayla now, at the small dampened human on the tether, and there was something in the composed scholar's face that was not quite fear and not quite respect, and was, Veth thought, the closest a man like Orth Vane could come to awe. "I told the directorate the danger was what she could do to an enemy. I was wrong about the danger. The danger was never the reading. It was that she would read us." He unfolded his upper hands, the scholar's shrug for the last time. "You didn't win a battle, girl. You never fought one. You just knew from the first day exactly how every one of us would move, including me, and you let us move ourselves into a corner and call it a victory." He lowered his hands. "Fleet Master, I'll go with your wardens. There's nothing left in this room I can change." The wardens took him, and because they were wardens their weapons hung on the left and they moved left before right, and it did not matter now. And Selah, dampened, silent, an instrument switched down, noted it anyway, because she could not stop, because they had built her that way and there was no switching that off, only down. Aboard the lead ship of the Kestrel flotilla, 4 hours out of nothing and closing on a graveyard, Commander Iyari Sund watched a conquered war fleet finish killing something enormous, and understood that she had brought 7 ships to the wrong funeral. She had come for a convoy. 400 colonists, overdue 4 months, last logged at the Marrow approaches. A search, not a battle, the kind of quiet, grim errand the Halden Yard sent their oldest commanders on because it did not need reflexes, only patience and a strong stomach. She had expected wreckage. She had not expected to drop out of the deep on the edge of the largest fleet engagement she had ever seen, the Marrow Gap strewn with the broken formations of a species she did not recognize, and a conquered armada, hundreds of ships, the real thing, the civilization that had never once answered a human hail with more than contempt, sitting in the daylight of the Gap having just won a war. "They see us," her censor officer said. He was young, too young for this, and his voice was tight. "Commander, elements of the fleet are, some of them are turning toward us. Heavy elements, weapons, hot posture." Iyari Sund had 40 years and had used most of them learning when a fight was a fight and when it was already over. 7 undergunned ships against a conquered battle fleet was not a fight. It was a decision about how to die, and she had time to make exactly one call, and she made it the way she made all of them, slowly, out loud, so her crew could hear that someone was still thinking. "Hold, no one arms anything. If they wanted us dead, we'd be a cloud already." She watched the plate. "Something's wrong over there. Look at the fleet, it's not maneuvering like a fleet. It's coming apart. Half of it's turning our way and the other half's, what is the other half doing?" "Some of them are moving to screen us," the young officer said, disbelieving. "Conquered ships. They're putting themselves between us and the rest of the fleet. And Commander, we're getting a wideband transmission. Uncoded, in clear, it's addressed to us. It's addressed to the flotilla by name." "Read it." He read it. He read the sampling logs and the cradle manifests, and the projections and a contingency directive in an alien counselor's own hand. And he read the part where 411 colonists were alive in reclamation storage on the flagship's 3rd medical deck. And he got to the line about the youngest sampled subject being 9 years old, and his voice stopped working. And Iyari Sund finished reading it herself off his screen in the silence. And then she sat very still for a moment in the daylight of an alien graveyard, and did the arithmetic of what she was looking at. "Confirm the life signs," she said at last quietly. "The flagship, 3rd medical deck. Tell me if there are 400 people alive on that ship." "There are 411, Commander." The young officer's hands were shaking on the console. "They're alive. We're reading them. They're right there." A conquered ship hailed them then, a single ship, 3-ship element, holding the screen at the low approaches. And the voice that came across was alien and steady, and spoke the trade tongue with the flatness of a soldier who has decided something, and is finished being afraid of it. "Kestrel Flotilla, this is Sub-Commander Veth Oma of the conquered fleet. Do not arm. Do not run. The fleet is not going to fire on you, most of it anyway, and the part that might is being dealt with. Your people are alive on our flagship and they are coming back to you. I need you to hold your position and let us bring them out because they've been through something and moving them wrong will hurt them, and we have people who can move them right. I know you have no reason on this world to trust a conquered voice." A pause. "So don't trust me. Trust the record we sent you. Read it twice. Then hold and let us give your people back." Iari Sund had spent 40 years learning to hear the difference between a voice that was managing her and a voice that was telling her the truth and did not expect to be believed. And this was the second kind. She looked at the plate, the screen of conquered ships interposing themselves at real risk between her flotilla and the guns of their own fleet, and she made the call she would spend the rest of her life being asked about. "Hold position," she said. "Nobody arms anything. Nobody runs." She keyed the hail. "Sub-Commander, this is Commander Sund. We'll hold. You bring my people out and you bring them out gentle, and we will remember for a long time which conquered voices were on which side of this today." She paused and added, because 40 years had taught her that too. "There's a reason your fleet's coming apart over there. A reason with a name." "There is," Veth said. "Her name is Sayla Rourke. She was on your convoy. Ask your people about her when you have them back." "I don't think they'll have known what she was doing." "I'm not sure I do." A beat. "She's the reason your 7 ships aren't a cloud, Commander. Hold your position. We're bringing them out." The name went through the Kestrel flotilla's decks, the way a name does when it belongs to someone thought lost. And on the lead ship, an old woman at a comm station who had crewed the missing convoy's sister, Run put a hand over her mouth, because she had known a Sayla Rourke, a quiet, quick girl who read storm fronts for the rescue service and called the debris cascades before the sensors did, and she had assumed, like everyone had assumed, that whatever the aliens had swept up at the Marrow approaches was 4 months dead. Commander Sund did not know the name, but she filed it, the way careful people file the names of those they owe, and she held her position in the daylight of the Marrow Gap and waited for an alien fleet to hand her back 411 people, and she thought, whatever that girl did over there, she did it from inside. She did it with no ship and no gun and no fleet of her own. She did it with the one thing they couldn't take off her when they cut her open, and she turned the whole of it around on the people holding the knife. It was the closest anyone in the Kestrel flotilla came, that day, to understanding what had happened at the Marrow Gap, and it was not close, and Iari Sund knew it was not close, and she held her position anyway and waited. 3 decks below the command dome, Kyrogen Prime Osk stood in the warm daylit chamber the manifest called Reclamation Storage, and listened to his fleet stop being the thing he had believed it was. He had dampened the subject 4 minutes ago. He had done it gently, the way he did everything, closing the door in her head to a crack with the same absorbed craftsman's care he had used to open it, because a counselor had told him the instrument was compromised, and dampening a compromised instrument was prudent medicine. He had not, in the moment, let himself hear what she was saying on the channel as he did it. He had learned, over a long and decorated career, not to hear certain things while his hands were working. It was, he would come to understand, the central skill of his life, and it was not a skill he was proud of once he finally set it down. Now the channel was full of a fleet coming apart, and the record was in every deck, his own logs, his own careful notes. Subject is a rarity, a fine instrument found in a scrapyard, and past the second wall 411 human beings shifted and murmured in the cradles he had built, and Kyrogen Prime Osk stood among his own work and heard it, at last, all of it, with his hands still. The order came from the fleet master directly: release the colonists, care for them. Whatever the medical caste had done to warehouse them, the medical caste would now undo, gently, completely, and any Kyrogen who refused would answer to Drod Corvin personally. It was, Osk noted with the small clinical part of him that never stopped, an easy order to obey, because it asked him only to be good at the thing he was good at, in the other direction. He went to the cradles himself. He would not delegate it. He moved down the rows with the same care he had moved down them building, and he woke the sampled and the unsampled alike, gently, and he told them, in the trade tongue and through the flotilla's translators, that they were going home, and he watched 411 human faces do the thing human faces did that the conquered had catalogued as weakness, the crumpling, the noise, the reaching for each other, and he understood, standing among them, that he had spent a career mistaking a strength for a flaw, because the flaw was easier to cut. The 9-year-old was in the 41st cradle. Osk had done the sampling himself, weeks ago, and had noted the child too coarse in the relevant structures to be worth the work, and had moved on. He woke her gently now, and she looked at him with no fear at all, because she was 9 and did not yet know what he was, and she asked him, through the translator, whether her mother was on the ship, and Osk, who had faced a directorate inquiry and a war and the cold end of his own career without his hands shaking, found that his hands were shaking. "Yes," he said, "she's in the next row. I'll take you to her." He took her to her, and then he went to find the subject, because there was one more thing his hands had to undo, and it was the thing he understood least. They had moved Sailor Rourke off the command ring and into a recovery cell, dampened, quiet, an instrument switched down, and when Osk came in she was sitting on the shelf that served as a bed exactly as she always sat, weight even, hands loose, and she looked at him with the door in her head closed to the crack he had left her, and he saw that even through the crack she was reading him, slower now, shallower, but reading, because they had built her that way and there was no bottom to it he had ever found. "You knew I would be the one to do it," Osk said. He did not sit. "The dampening. You knew when you gave that read on the ring, when you told the whole fleet the truth, you knew the counselor's first move would be to have me close you down. You could have said it faster. You could have gotten more out before the door shut. You let me reach you." His antennae moved, the insectoid equivalent of a man rubbing his face. "You wanted to be dampened. It was part of it. The fleet needed to watch him silence you. You spent your own voice the way you spent that picket squadron." Sailor did not answer for a moment. When she spoke it was slow, the words coming through the crack with effort and flat, and there was no accusation in it, which was somehow worse than accusation. "You weren't cruel," she said. "That's why it had to be you. A cruel man the fleet forgives because cruelty's a reason. But you were gentle the whole time. You told me I was fortunate. You built cradles for children and you built them well so they wouldn't be uncomfortable." She looked at him through the crack. "The fleet watched a gentle man close down the person telling the truth. That's the picture that turned them, not the counselor. You. I needed the kindest one of you to do the worst thing on an open channel so the rest of them would finally see that gentle and right aren't the same and that you'd all been telling yourselves they were." A pause. "I'm sorry. It was the cheapest move I had. It cost you the most and it cost me the least, and that's why I took it. That's what I am now. I take the cheap move." Chirurgeon Prime Osk stood in the recovery cell and understood that he had been a piece on a board for 24 days, that the fine instrument he had found in a scrapyard had used his own hands, his own gentleness, his own decorated career, as the final move in a sequence that ended his cast's program and his counselor's life, and his own certainty about every kind thing he had ever done. He understood that she had read him to the bottom on the first day, the way she read everyone, and had known that the kindest surgeon in the fleet would be the one whose betrayal the fleet could not forgive. And he understood, last and worst, that she was not wrong about any of it, because she was never wrong about any of it, because they had made her unable to be. "I can reopen it," he said quietly when he could speak. "The door. The dampening isn't permanent unless it's left. I can put you back to the full of what we made you, or I can leave it at the crack or close it the rest of the way, or," his hands moved, helpless, "undo as much as can be undone. It won't be all of it. We opened something that doesn't fully close, but I can give you back some quiet if you want it. You've earned quiet, if anyone in this fleet has." And Sailor Rourke, who had spent 24 days seeing every move before it came, who had not been surprised by anything since the day they took the walls off her mind, sat on the shelf in the daylight and was, for the first time in a long time, at a place in the pattern where more than one branch was open, where the next move was hers and not read off anyone else, and she found that she did not know which one she wanted. And that not knowing was the strangest and most human thing she had felt in 4 months. The handover took 2 days, because doing it gently took 2 days, and Veth Oma spent both of them learning that winning is a great deal more work than losing. The fleet did not come back together so much as it agreed, ship by ship, on what it had become. A third of it had turned at the Marrow Gap, the rest had held. And now, with the counselor relieved and the record in every deck, the 2/3 that had held had to decide whether they had held out of loyalty or out of fear. And the answer, for most of them, turned out to be the ordinary human, the ordinary living answer, which is that they had held because turning was frightening and no one had gone first, and once someone had gone first, going was easy. Drod Corvin spent the 2 days being the someone who had gone first, walking his decks in the daylight, letting the crews look at him, an old soldier who had spent 2 ships and won a war and then countermanded a counselor, so that every officer in the fleet could see that the man who had done all 3 did not think they were contradictions. Veth ran the handover of the colonists because Drod gave it to him, and because it was the kind of work Veth was good at, careful, procedural, 1,000 small correct decisions. The Iridect brought the 411 out of the cradles gently, over 2 days, and the Kestrel flotilla took them aboard, and Veth watched the reunions across the docking feeds and did not look away, because he had decided he was done not hearing things while his hands worked. He watched an old woman from the flotilla's comm station find a quiet, quick girl she had assumed 4 months dead. Except it was not the girl she was looking for. It was a cousin, and the woman held the cousin and asked, over and over, about sailor work, and the cousin did not know, because the cousin had been in a cradle for 4 months and had never known sailor was on the flagship at all, had never known any of it, had only known the dark and the cold, and then the gentle blue chitinous hands waking her and telling her she was going home. None of the 411 had known what sailor was doing. She had done the whole of it alone, in a warm cell under a false window, with no one to tell and no one who would have believed her, and she had spent her own people's rescue as a piece on the board, without any of them ever knowing they had been played for, because telling them would have been a move, and moves were watched. That was the thing Veth could not get past in the 2 days, not the strategy, the loneliness of it. He went to see her on the 2nd day, when the last of the colonists were aboard the flotilla and the fleet had finished deciding what it was. He had never spoken to her. 24 days of watching her work, 1 battlefield read that had put his name in her sequence, and he had never once stood in a room with her and said a word. And now he stood in the door of a recovery cell and found the small human sitting on a shelf in the daylight exactly as she sat everywhere, weight even, hands loose, and he did not know how to start. So he started the way soldiers start, with the truth. "You spent my crews," Veth said, "the sedan or picket, 400 and some of my own, and you saw it coming 3 days out, and you let it happen because saving them would have shown the counselor how far you were reading." It was not an accusation. He had come to say it because it was true, and because she deserved to be spoken to by someone who knew all of it. "And you spent the same 3 days making sure the sub-commander sent to the depots would be me. You had it all laid out, every piece, me included." "Yes," Sayla said. The word came slow through the crack Osk had left her. She had not yet decided about the door. All of it. "How do you carry that?" It was not a question a tactician asked. It was a question a man asked. "The picket, you knew their names by the end, you must have, you read everything." Sayla was quiet for a moment. "I read their names," she said. 431 of them. I made myself read the crew manifest before I did it, so I couldn't tell myself they were just 2 ships. I looked at it until it stopped moving." She turned her head and looked at him, and for the first time Veth saw, through the flatness, the thing the flatness had been holding down for 24 days, and it was not cold at all. It had never been cold. The cold was just the wall she'd built so the room couldn't read her the way she read the room. "I carry it the way you carry the crews you've spent in 9 years, Sub-Commander. I don't. It carries me. I just decided a long time ago that if I was going to be a thing that spends people, I'd spend them for the largest number, and I'd never once let myself pretend it was free." Veth Oma looked at the small human who had ended a war she never fought and a program that would have swallowed her whole species, who had done it with the one thing they could not cut out of her, alone, at a cost she had counted to the last name, and he understood that the conquered had gone looking for a weapon and found a conscience, and had been too frightened of the weapon to notice the conscience was the more dangerous thing. When they cut you open, he said, the counselor thought they'd made a machine, the fleet master thought they'd made a machine, I think even the surgeon half thought so. He paused. You let all of us keep thinking it, right to the end. You could have shown us sooner what you were. You'd have been treated better. Being treated better wasn't the move, Sayla said. A machine gets watched less than a person. I needed to be watched less. She looked at him. You worked it out before the end, on your own. That's why it was you. I read a lot of things about you, Sub-Commander, but the one I built the whole thing on was that you'd rather know an ugly truth than hold a comfortable lie, and that once you knew it you wouldn't be able to unknow it and you'd move. I couldn't make you move. I could only put you where moving was the only honest thing left. The rest was yours. Veth was quiet for a long moment in the daylight. It was mine, he agreed. I want it to have been mine. A pause. It was, wasn't it? You didn't. There's no version where you made me. I chose it. You chose it, Sayla said. I only knew which way you'd choose. Those aren't the same thing. If they were, I'd be exactly the weapon he wanted, and I'm not. Knowing how a good man will move isn't the same as moving him. That's the whole difference. It's the only difference that matters. I spent 4 months making sure I stayed on the right side of it, because the day I stop being able to tell those two apart is the day they finally do get their weapon. She looked at him and the wall was back up, but he had seen behind it now, and they both knew he had, and neither of them said anything about it, because they were both, in their different ways, people who did not say the things they had already shown. The record reached the core ward conquered 11 days after the Marrow Gap, and it did to the Directorate what Sayla Rourke had known it would do, which was not what anyone hoped and not what anyone feared, but the third thing, the true thing, the thing she had read in the pattern and no one else had. It did not, as the honest officers of the Marrow Fleet hoped, simply end the program and punish the guilty. Directorates do not work that way. A body that large does not feel shame, only exposure, and a body that feels exposure does not repent, it manages. Orith Vane was disavowed, which was easy, because a relieved counselor sitting in a conquered brig was already a man the Directorate could afford to have never really known. The sampling program was suspended, which was also easy, because a suspended program can be resumed. The 411 went home to the Verge aboard the Kestrel flotilla, which cost the Directorate nothing and bought it the appearance of mercy. But it did not, as the frightened part of the Directorate wanted, end there either. Because the record had done more than expose a crime. It had proven a fact, the fact Orith had built his whole campaign to prove, and the fact was still true even though the man who meant to weaponize it was in a brig. A single sampled human, a hazard analyst from a rescue station, opened up by the medical cast, had read a fleet and a war and a counselor to the bottom, and bent all three to her will without firing a shot. The demonstration had been meant to frighten the Directorate into quarantining the Verge. It had been broadcast and clear to the entire Conquered, and the Directorate was, in fact, frightened. Drod Corvin understood the danger before the Corward reply even arrived, because he had spent 11 days sitting with an old soldier's instinct that winning was not the same as being safe. He convened his captains in the command dome in the daylight, and he laid it out plainly. The Verge is not safer than it was, he said. It's in more danger. 11 days ago the Directorate thought humans were primitive and far away. Now it knows what a human mind can become, and it has watched one become it and take a fleet. Vane wanted them to be afraid so they'd quarantine the Verge out of ambition. He's in a brig, and the fear is still here, and fear doesn't need a counselor to make it move. A frightened Directorate does the thing that feels safe, and the thing that feels safe, to a body that just watched a human outthink an armada, is to make sure it never happens again, by making sure there's no Verge left to sample. He looked around the daylit ring. We didn't end this at the marrow gap. We changed what shape it comes in. And I want the read on what shape that is before the coreword reply arrives, not after. So they brought Sayla up to the ring one more time, and this time no one called her the subject and no one called her the read, and this time the door in her head was the question in front of her, because she could not read the coreword directorate several moves ahead through a crack. Osk had not reopened it. She had not asked him to. She stood in the daylight in front of a fleet that had turned for her and looked at the plate, where there was no battle now, only the long, empty vector coreword down which the Concord's answer was coming, and Drod said, "Can you read it? What they'll do? From here." "Not through the dampening," Sayla said. "Through the crack I can read this room. To read a directorate 11 days coreword I need the door open, all of it." She was quiet for a moment. "You should know what you're asking for before I answer it. Open, I don't stop. I haven't stopped once since they took the walls off except these 11 days, and these 11 days are the first quiet I've had since the rescue tender. Open, I read every one of you every time you walk into a room forever, and I read the directorate, and I read whatever comes after the directorate, and I never get to be surprised by a single thing again as long as I live. That's not a complaint, it's the price of the answer. You're asking me to pay it in front of you so you can decide what to do about a frightened empire. I'll pay it, but I want the fleet to watch me pay it, the way they watched the surgeon close me down. I'm tired of being a thing that gets used without anyone seeing the cost." The command ring was silent in the daylight. Drod Corvin, old enough to know what he was being handed, inclined his heavy head. "The fleet's watching," he said. "Open it." Osk came up to the ring to do it, because it had to be him, and he did it in front of the whole command staff. Gently, the way he did everything, reopening the door in the small human's head with the same absorbed care he had used to open it the first time and to close it. And this time the fleet watched, and this time everyone in the daylight understood what they were watching, which was a person choosing to give up the last quiet she would ever have so that a frightened empire could be read before it moved. Sayla Rourke stood in the daylight as the door came open and the whole of it came back, the fleet, the room, the empty coreword vector, the pattern running forward move after move after move without walls and without mercy, and she did not flinch, because flinching was a thing for people who were surprised, and she was never going to be surprised again. She looked coreward at 11 days of empty space, and she read the directorate's answer before it arrived. "They won't move on the verge," she said. "Not now they want to. The frightened ones are already drafting it, a preemptive quarantine, the sampling program made permanent, the whole thing Vane wanted, argued from fear instead of ambition, and it's the more dangerous version because fear doesn't relieve itself of command." She watched it, unhurried. "But they won't do it, and I'll tell you exactly why, and you're going to want to write it down, because it's the only thing keeping the verge alive and it has to keep being true. They won't move on the verge because they know I'll read it coming. They watched me do it. It's in the record. Every directorate strategist who reaches for a plan against the verge now reaches for it knowing there's a human mind that will see the plan before it's finished, the way I saw Vane's, and turn it around on them the way I turned his. They don't have to believe I'll be there. They only have to not be sure I won't. I made myself at the marrow gap into the reason their best plans can't be trusted. That's the deterrent. Not a fleet, not a weapon, a doubt. As long as they can't be certain the verge won't read them, the safe move is to leave it alone, and a frightened directorate always takes the safe move. A pause. I spent 4 months and 431 lives making the safe move be mercy. Keep it that way. Don't let them get certain. The coreword reply came on the 19th day, and it was, in the way of large frightened bodies, a great deal of language arranged to say very little, and the little it said was exactly what Sayla had read off 19 days of empty space. The directorate deplored the actions of the disavowed Counselor Vane. The directorate affirmed its commitment to lawful conduct toward emergent peoples. The directorate would review the medical cast's research protocols. The directorate proposed, in the interest of stability, a formal channel of communication with the human worlds of the verge, to be administered through the Marrow Fleet under Fleet Master Corving, whose conduct the Directorate found itself, after due consideration, prepared to commend. There was no quarantine. There was no fleet. There was, buried under the language, the thing Sayla had said would be there, a body that wanted very badly to move on the verge and had decided, for reasons it would never write down, that it could not be certain enough of the outcome to try. Drod Corvin read the reply to his captains in the daylight and understood that he had just been handed a border to hold, honestly, for the rest of his career, and that it was the first honest thing the Conquered had asked of him in 9 years, and that he owed the honesty of it to a small human who had spent his own cruise to buy it. He accepted the command. He was old, and he had spent 40 years learning that the work you are given at the end is rarely the work you wanted and is sometimes, if you are lucky, the work that was worth the whole of the rest. Veth Oma requested reassignment the same day, and he requested it before Sayla told him he would, which mattered to him, though he suspected she had known anyway. "I want the Verge posting," he told Drod, in the passage behind the command ring where the two of them could speak. "The liaison, the Conquered's officer at the human worlds. Somebody's going to hold that channel, and it's going to matter who, because the whole piece runs on the Verge trusting that there are Conquered voices worth trusting. And 11 days ago I put myself between our fleet and their flotilla on an open channel and they saw me do it. I've got standing there that a stranger won't." And he paused and said the true thing because he had decided he was done with the other kind. "I owe them a border held right. I spent 9 years holding the wrong line. I'd like to spend whatever's left holding one I believe in." Drod looked at his subcommander for a long moment and then promoted him on the spot, because a fleet master handed a border needs officers who ask for the hard postings, and gave him the Verge liaison, and told him to take a fast ship and catch the Kestrel flotilla before it made the Halden yards, because the flotilla was carrying 411 colonists home and one more besides, and the one more besides ought to arrive with a Conquered officer at her side who knew what she had done, so that her own people would understand from the first that she came home owed and not suspected. Because Saylarurk was going home, that had never been in question. The moment the door was open and the deterrent was set and the reply was read, there was nothing to keep her in the Marrow, and everything, 411 of her own people, a world she had been taken from, a rescue service and a cracked display and storm fronts to read, pulling her back to the Verge. She boarded the Kestrel flotilla's lead ship on the 20th day, and Commander Iyari Sund met her at the airlock and looked at the small dirt-flecked young woman who had, from inside an enemy flagship, with no ship and no gun, turned a war fleet and saved 411 lives and her whole species besides, and did not know what to say, because 40 years had not prepared her for the size of the debt or the smallness of the person carrying its other end. "I don't have the words for it," Sund said finally, because it was true and Sayla would know if it wasn't. "You don't need them," Sayla said. "You held your position when every reflex you had said fire or run. That's the whole reason there was anyone to bring home. The words are yours to keep, Commander. I've got enough of everyone's words already." She went home, and home was the cost, and she had read the cost before she ever boarded, and reading it had not made it lighter. Because her people loved her and could not look at her, that was the shape of it. The 411 she had bought knew now, on the long ride to the Halden yards, what she had done and what it had cost and what she had become to do it, and they were grateful the way you are grateful to the thing that saved you at a price you can never repay and can never quite stop seeing, which is to say they were grateful and afraid in the same breath. And Sayla read both every time one of them came near, the gratitude and the fear tangled together, and neither of them anything she could put down. The quiet, quick girl who had read storm fronts off a cracked display was 4 months dead as the convoy had been assumed to be, and in her place had come home a young woman who walked into every room already knowing how everyone in it would move, who could not be surprised and could not be lied to, and could not, any longer, Be simply among people the way a person is among people, easy and unknowing and safe. The 9-year-old from the 41st cradle was the exception. The child did not know enough to be afraid, and she attached herself to Sayla on the long ride home, the way children attach themselves to the calmest adult in a frightening place, and asked her endless questions, and Sayla answered them. And the child was, for a few hours a day, the one person aboard the flotilla who looked at Sayla and saw only Sayla, and Sayla found that she guarded those hours the way you guard the last of something you know you cannot get more of. Veth caught the flotilla 2 days out from the Halden yards, and he found her on the observation deck of the lead ship, watching the human stars come up ahead, real stars now, home stars, the verge resolving out of the deep. And he stood beside her at the port, and neither of them said anything for a while, because they were both people who did not say the things they had already shown, and the not saying was, between the two of them, its own kind of speech. "They're afraid of you," Veth said at last. "Your own people." "Yes," Sayla said. "That's the cost, the real one, not the picket, not the door." He was a tactician. He named things accurately even when they were terrible. You bought all of them a future, and the price was that you don't get to be one of them anymore. You get to be the thing that saved them, which is a lonelier country than any of them will ever understand. "Yes," Sayla said again, and then after a moment, because he had said the true thing and true things deserved answering, "I read it before I started, all of it. The picket, the door, this. I did the arithmetic on what it would cost me, the same as everything else, and I looked at it until it stopped moving, and I did it anyway, because the number on the other side was 411 people, and a whole world that got to stay free." She watched the home stars come up. "You don't get to choose whether it costs you. You only get to choose whether it was worth it. I chose. I'd choose it again. That's not the same as it not hurting. I gave up being able to tell myself comfortable lies, Sub-Commander. I didn't give up the part of me that would like one." The Kestrel flotilla made the Halden yards on the 24th day, 4 months and some to the day since a colony convoy had gone quiet at the Marrow approaches, and 411 people came home to a system that had already held their funerals. There is no describing what a system does when it gets its dead back alive, and Sayla did not try to be in the middle of it. She read, from the flotilla's deck, the shape of the joy spreading across the Halden yards as the manifest went out, and she let her people have it, all 411 of them, folding back into families that had stopped waiting, and she stayed on the deck with the 9-year-old until the child's mother came to collect her, and the mother looked at Sayla and did the grateful and afraid thing, and the child hugged Sayla around the waist and did not, and then they were both gone into the crowd. And Sayla Rourke came home to the verge the way she had done everything for 4 months, at the edge of the frame, watching, unsurprised. Kairogen Prime Osk did not come home to the verge, because it was not his home, but he came, which no one had expected, least of all Osk. He had requested passage on the Kestrel flotilla, and Drod had permitted it over the objections of officers who thought the surgeon belonged in a brig beside the counselor. And Osk had spent the ride doing the one thing left that his hands were good for, tending the 411 he had warehoused, undoing gently and completely whatever the sampling had done, walking the flotilla's medical bays for 24 days, making certain that not one of the people he had wronged carried a mark of it home. It did not balance. He knew it did not balance. He was a precise creature, and he did not permit himself the comfort of pretending a debt like his could be paid in careful hours. But he had decided, somewhere in the warm daylit chamber that had called itself reclamation storage, that a man who discovers late what his gentleness has served owes the rest of his gentleness to the other side of the ledger, whether or not the ledger ever comes clean, and he intended to spend it there. He asked Sayla, before the flotilla dispersed, the question he had been carrying since the recovery cell. "Would you have me undo it?" he said. "The augmentation. If I could, and I have thought about whether I could, and I believe, given time, I could bring you most of the way back to what you were. The quiet, quick girl who read Storm Fronts. Not all the way, but close. I built it. I could unbuild it. I am offering, Sailor Rourke, because it is the one thing I have that you might actually want, and because I would like, once, to use these hands to give a human being back something instead of taking it." Sailor was quiet for a long moment, and it was, Osk saw, a real quiet and not a reed. One of the rare places where more than one branch was open and the next move was hers. "No," she said at last. "Thank you, and no." She looked at him. "If you unbuild it, the deterrent's gone. The whole piece runs on the Directorate not being certain the Verge can read them. The day I go back to being the quiet, quick girl is the day some frightened strategist in the Corward Dark does the arithmetic and finds the numbers changed, and the safe move isn't mercy anymore. I made myself the reason their plans can't be trusted. I don't get to unmake it just because it's lonely. That's the trade. I read it going in." A pause. "But I'll tell you what I do want from those hands, Chirurgeon, if you meant the offer." "Name it." "There'll be others. There already are. You sampled 400 people and found me, which means the structures you were looking for aren't as rare as your cast told itself. Someday the Verge is going to decide it wants its own instruments, its own people who can do what I do, because that's what worlds do when they learn a thing is possible, and their enemies know it too. And when that day comes, they're going to need someone who knows the work and knows what it costs and won't tell a frightened girl she's fortunate while he takes the walls off her mind." She looked at the surgeon who had not been cruel, which had been the worst thing about him and might yet be the most useful. "You know the work. You know the cost now, really know it, not the way you knew it when you called me a fine instrument. If the Verge ever does this to its own children, I want the person holding the knife to be someone who has stood where you're standing and understood exactly what he's doing. That's the debt, Osk. Not undoing me. Making sure the next one gets done right or doesn't get done at all. Stay. Teach it honest. It's a harder penance than a brig, and it's worth more." Chirurgeon Prime Osk, who had come to the Verge expecting to be hated, and had instead been handed the one task that might, over a long life, mean something, inclined his blue chitinous head and stayed, and that is a longer story than this one and not for telling here. Sailor did not go back to the rescue service. She had thought she might, on the ride home, that she might climb back onto a tender and read storm fronts off a cracked display, and let the augmentation be a private strange thing she used to call debris cascades before the censors did. She understood, within a day of the Halden Yards, that it was not going to be possible, because the Verge knew now what she was, and the Verge needed what she was, and a world does not let a thing like her go read weather at the margins when there is a border to hold, and a Corward Dark full of frightened strategists to be read. They made a place for her because they had to. It did not have a good name. The human worlds were new to the kind of institution that has a person like Sailor at the center of it, and they fumbled the shape of it for a while. But the substance was simple. When the Verge needed to know what the Conquered would do, or what the Directorate was drafting in the Corward Dark, or whether a treaty was a treaty or a trap, they brought it to Sailor Rourke, and she read it, and she was right. And slowly the human worlds learned to do the thing the Conquered had never quite managed, which was to have a mind like hers among them and neither worship it nor fear it into a corner, but simply, carefully, listen to it. A year on, the border held, and Veth Oma had learned that holding a border you believe in is the hardest and best work a soldier is ever given. He kept his post at a station the human worlds had built at the edge of the Verge, a small daylit thing hung in the reflected blue of a colony world, where the Conquered's channel to the human worlds ran through one honest officer, and a staff he had chosen for the same stubborn quality he had spent 9 years being punished for. The peace was not friendship. He harbored no illusion that it was. It was two frightened powers holding still because neither could be certain of the outcome of moving, and the thing that kept them still had a name, and the name lived on the colony world below and was brought to the station whenever the stillness wobbled. It wobbled that year 4 times. 3 of them were nothing. A Corward fleet exercise that read, to nervous human sensors like a massing, a directorate trade delegation with more escorts than trade, a border incident with a Thren remnant that wanted only to be left alone to die. Each time the human worlds brought it to Sayla, and each time she read it to the bottom in a few flat sentences and told them what it was and what it wasn't and what would happen if they answered it wrong, and each time she was right, and the stillness settled. The fourth was not nothing, and it was the one that taught Veth Oma, finally and completely, what the Verge had in her. A faction in the Coreward Directorate, not the whole body, a faction, the frightened kind that never fully lets a thing go, had spent the year doing the arithmetic Sayla had warned them all against, and had convinced itself that the deterrent was a bluff, that one human mind could not truly read an empire, that the Marrow Gap had been a counselor's blunder and not a law of nature. They drafted a move. It was subtle, not a fleet, nothing so crude but a diplomatic sequence, a treaty offered to the Verge with a hook buried 9 clauses deep, a thing that would have looked, to any human negotiator, like the generous formalizing of the peace, and would have ended, 4 moves later, with the Verge's own signature authorizing a conquered research presence in human space and the sampling program reborn with the Verge's consent. They brought it to Sayla in the daylight of the station, the human negotiators and Veth, and a room full of people who wanted very badly for the generous treaty to be exactly as generous as it looked, because a year of holding still is tiring, and everyone wants the tiredness to end. Sayla read it for 11 seconds, which Veth had learned was a long read for her, and then she said, "Don't sign it," and told them where the hook was, and walked them forward through the 4 moves to the reborn program and the cradles and the children, and the room went cold and quiet the way rooms did around her, and the generous treaty went back Coreward unsigned with a human counterdraft that closed every door the hook had come through, and the frightened faction, learning that the Verge had read the hook 9 clauses deep and named it, did the arithmetic one more time, and found the number unchanged and put the whole idea back down. Afterward Veth found her on the station's observation deck, where she went when the reading was done, and he stood beside her at the port the way he had a year ago on the flotilla, and for a while neither of them said anything, because they were still the same 2 people who did not say the things they had already shown. "They'll try again," Veth said. "The frightened ones, they'll never fully stop." "No," Sayla said. "They never will. Fear doesn't relieve itself of command. I told the fleet master that a year ago and it's still true. Every few years, someone in the Coreward Dark is going to decide the deterrent's a bluff and reach for a plan, and every few years someone's going to have to read it before it lands and turn it around." She watched the colony world turn, blue and small, below. "That's the shape of it now. That's the border. It isn't held with ships. It's held with the fact that they can't be sure. And the fact that they can't be sure has to stay true, which means it has to stay standing here in a room reading them for as long as I'm able." A pause. "It's not a war that ends. It's a war that gets held. I read that going in too." Veth Oma looked at the small human who had held a border for a year with the one thing they could not cut out of her, and who would, he understood, hold it for the rest of her life. Alone in the lonely country she had bought her people, unsurprised and unable to be surprised, reading the Coreward Dark so 411 people, and a whole world could sleep not knowing her name. "Does any of it get easier?" he asked. It was not a tactician's question. He had stopped in a year being only a tactician. The reading, the knowing, being the thing they're afraid of, any of it. "No," Sayla said, "it doesn't get easier. I stopped waiting for it too." She was quiet a moment. "But there's one thing I kept. You want to know what I do up here, when the reading's done and there's nothing left that needs turning around?" "Tell me." She lifted a hand toward the port, toward the colony world below, where a weather system was turning slow and white across the blue, a storm front wheeling up over an ocean, the kind of pattern she had read off a cracked display for a rescue service a lifetime and 4 months ago, before anyone had taken the walls off her mind. "I read the weather," Sayla Rourke said. "Down there, The storm fronts the way I used to. I can't turn it off, the reading, it runs whether I point it or not forever at everyone and everything. But I get to choose sometimes what I point it at. And when there's no fleet to read and no treaty with a hook in it and no frightened empire drafting the end of my people in the dark, I point it at the weather over the water, and I call the storm before the storm knows it's coming, and I don't do anything about it, and no one lives or dies on whether I'm right. She watched the white system wheel over the blue. It's the only thing I read anymore that doesn't cost anyone anything. It's the last piece of her I kept. The quiet, quick girl. I let her have the weather. The storm front turned over the ocean below, slow and white and indifferent, and the small dirt-flecked young woman at the port watched it come the way she watched everything come, several moves ahead, unsurprised. And for once the knowing did not cost her a thing, and she stood in the daylight and let herself have it, the one pattern in the whole reading universe that asked nothing of her but to be seen. Veth Oma stood beside her and watched the weather he could not read turn over a world he had helped keep free, and understood that he was in the presence of the most dangerous mind in the settled galaxy, and that it was spending the afternoon reading rain on purpose, because it was the only rest it would ever get. And he did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that she had not already read in the way he stood there and did not leave. Below them the storm came in off the water exactly when she had known it would and broke over the colony, and the rain fell on 411 people who were alive, and on a whole world that was free, and on none of them knowing why, and Sailor Rourke watched all of it, and was, in the small way that was the only way left to her, content.